analysis project and program. My name is Deb Myhoff with Communitas. I am the facilitator for the HOG, as we affectionately call it. Let's start off with, I know folks are still coming in, but I think we have critical mass here. Let's start off with some introductions. Then I'll do an overview of the agenda and then we'll get rolling for the day. So I introduced myself. Let's go first to DLCD staff. Thea, do you want to kick them off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here with you all today. Thea Croman, she, her pronouns. I'm a housing planner with DLCD.
Thank you. Sean?
Hi, folks. Sean Edging, a housing planner with the Housing Accountability and Production Office. I know I have a different background. Greetings from Ogden, Utah. I'm taking this meeting remotely. And the place where we're staying does have pretty good internet, but hopefully it stays that way. But yeah.
Fingers crossed. Thank you. Celestina.
Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all. Celestina Teva, she and they pronouns, housing planner here in the housing division at DLCD. Good to see you.
Great. And I think I saw Mari. Yeah, Mari, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Mari Valencia Aguilar, she, they, housing planner. Good to see you all.
Thank you for being here. Ingrid.
Morning, everyone. Ingrid Cordell, admin specialist at the Housing Division. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And as a reminder, I think you all know this by now, but if you're having any sort of technical difficulties, send a chat to Ingrid and she'll try to help problem solve with you and help you out with other technical needs throughout the meeting. Let's see, I know that Aurora.
Morning, everyone. Aurora Jettle, she, her. I'm a legislative analyst with the department.
Good morning. Glad you're here. Ethan. Good morning.
Hey, everyone. My name is Ethan Stugmeyer, manager of the housing division at DLCD. Thanks for being here.
Excellent. I think that's it for DLCD staff, but somebody let me know if I missed someone.
Joel, I think we're missing you.
Thank you. I did not see Joel in there.
Good morning, everyone. Joel Matson, you see him pronouns, Housing Accountability and Production Office Manager with DLCD.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Joel. Anyone else from DLCD I missed? All right. Any of our OHCS friends here yet?
We are missing Commissioner Lazo if he's on
Oh, my goodness. Sorry, y'all. Commissioner, welcome.
Morning. Good morning, all. Alan Lazo, he, him pronouns, LCDC Vice Chair.
Thank you, Alan. Always glad to see you here. The beginning of these meetings, the boxes are all moving around, so I have a hard time tracking people. I apologize for that. Let's go to the consultant team. Becky, you want to kick us off with that?
Sure. Hi, I'm Becky Hewitt, project director with Echo Northwest, and have been supporting Sean and the team at MIG that's going to introduce themselves and working through the model code. Maybe pass it over to Kathy next.
Hi, I'm Kathy Corliss. I'm principal with MIG, she, her pronouns, and we've been working on the model code, as Becky mentioned. Kate?
Yeah, good morning, all. Kate Rogers, she, her pronouns. I'm a senior planner and project manager with MIG and worked with Kathy and the team on the draft model code.
Excellent. And Kyle?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyle Mans, he, him. I work at Echo Northwest under Becky's team. I'm an associate, relatively new, but been helping with this since February and very happy to be here.
Great, thank you. I think that's it for the project team, unless someone else kicks me under the table. All right, let's move on to HOG members. And as always, I'm just going to do this alphabetically, which starts with Anne. Good morning, Anne.
Good morning, Anne Catlin with the City of Albany.
Good to see everybody.
Great to see you. And Ariel.
Hi, good morning. Ariel Kane, Economic Planner with the City of Portland. Good morning.
Brock.
Morning, Brock Nation, Policy Director, Oregon Realtors.
Thank you. Julia.
Sorry, that jumped to Jay's fast. Julia Metz with Sightline and Thousand Friends.
Excellent. Thank you. Good morning. Karen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Burig. I'm the Long Range Planning Manager at Clackamas County.
Thank you. Mac.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Mac Cunningham, Housing Developer at Community Partners for Affordable Housing.
Thank you. Mary Kyle.
Good morning, Mary Kyle McCurdy, Associate Director at 1000 Friends of Oregon.
Great. Matt.
Yeah, this is Matt Sears. I'm the Policy Director with the Oregon Council on Developmental Disabilities.
Glad you're here, Matt. Thank you. And Michael.
Michael Anderson with Sightline Institute. Hello.
And Rachel.
Morning, everyone. Rachel Mori Biju. I'm with the Network for Oregon Affordable Housing, also known as NOAA.
Great. Good morning. Glad everyone is here. Did I miss anyone? I think I got everyone unless someone joined in the last couple of minutes. All right, and we'll pick up any other latecomers throughout the discussion as we always do. So good morning. Sean, if you're not already, would you, I don't know who's driving the presentation today, but
I could drive.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you. The one detail we didn't talk about.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. Yeah, so I can kind of help.
Agenda, that would be great.
Perfect, yeah. All right, here we go.
Great, thank you. So as I'm sure you all know, the conversation today is focused entirely on the initial draft of the model code. We'll be talking about the racial equity framework for decision making and how that could further refine and shape the model code. We'll review and discuss the draft, and Sean will give us a bit of an overview, just a reminder about where this came from, how it's supposed to function, what it's supposed to do, what it is. Then he will start setting up. We have 3 discussion topics today as outlined in your agenda. He'll set up the first discussion topic. We'll have a discussion. He'll do a little more setup for the second one, then we'll have a discussion, and then the third and last one. And as Sean had mentioned in the email that went out with the agenda, he specifically, or the team is specifically bringing sort of 3 major questions for this conversation. There are other topics and other policy issues at stake. Sean also shared with you all, and he'll talk about that some more, some additional questions and ways to provide feedback on that. But for today's purposes, we're going to keep it sort of focused on these 3 biggies they could really use your help with. So just a reminder, Sean, you can go to the next page, please. Thank you. Reminder of HOG responsibilities and expectations. Of course, we request that you act in good faith and consider the viewpoints of everyone in the room. I know you all always come prepared, that you ask for assistance and support as you need it. And in our conversations, we ask that you honor the agenda and stay on topic, allow for a balance of speaking time. That's sort of, if you know that you're one that often speaks and there's some quieter voices, maybe just give it a beat or 2 and let some others enter the conversation so we can have a rich discussion of this. Please raise any items for discussion early. Address the issues and questions at hand, not individuals, and avoiding personal attacks. This is not about who's in the room. This is about the topic on the table, and trying to make this as good as we can. Please listen with respect, and side conversations aren't too much of an issue here. And then, of course, we are not here driving toward consensus, but we will flag when there seems to be some level of agreement in the room. What we're really here for is to make sure we have the breadth of opinions and information and ideas and knowledge that you all are bringing into the room and helping us apply that today to the model code. So I think we can move on. Sean, we don't have a slide before we go to racial equity framework. I did want to touch really briefly on some of the schedule changes you all have seen come through. Ingrid sent a number of notices about calendar notices. Some we had sort of sketched out or placeholders for a bunch of meetings later in the calendar year. I think maybe back in January or something. But since then, the schedule for the rest of the year has been solidified around the rulemaking calendar and all the sort of milestones that need to be met, along with sequencing with the rulemaking advisory committee. So I just want to voice that and point out, you all, at least on my end, and I'm guessing on your end, everything's been straightened out on the calendar. After today's meeting, we have 3 more meetings of the HOG. July 16th, August 20th, and October 15th. And again, those are timed with when products will be available for review, sequenced with the rulemaking advisory committee and the sort of more formal steps that move into rulemaking starting in September. So any questions about the upcoming 3 meetings, or is anyone, maybe if you're having trouble or you're not seeing those 3 meetings on your calendar, you can send a note or a chat to Ingrid and we can get you straightened out. Okay, great. Moving on then, Sean, please line us out for the racial equity framework for decision making.
Yeah, sure. And if I can also just chime in at the top too. So, in line with that kind of top, we'll discuss about this more in the next steps, but a big part of today's conversation is like this draft model code, which we scheduled to have, kind of released by the middle of the year, is really kind of a first impressions type document. We expect it to be refined a lot over the course of the later half of the year. It's actually kind of a major discussion point that we want to talk to, like what's the process that we use to get to a more refined draft that, of course, would be available for the public to comment on before we get to a kind of finalized draft for LCDC that's well honed in, well refined, et cetera, et cetera. I want to note, just a quick note on timing. I did send out a lot of materials before this meeting. I recognize the code itself is very long and not written as a very easily understandable document. It's written as a regulatory document. And kind of similar to last time, it provided different levels of depth that folks can grapple with some summary memoranda, obviously the code itself with some notes on how to kind of review and read it. And then also a set of kind of optional questions that, for the purpose of today's discussion, we don't really have time to dive into all the nitty-gritty details of some of those questions and, just general input on like specific provisions in the model code. But we do have a little bit of time before the biennium ends to kind of help arrange and organize our work plan. So something that I've asked in that message is we want you to provide written comments to us, especially on any detailed stuff that you think is important for us to start looking at and addressing in 2020 or the second half of this year. And so if you have the ability, please get us those comments by noon of Monday, this coming Monday. That'll give us about a week to be able to, kind of take the comments and be like, all right, we have this work plan. We're going to address all these different issues and use the time that we have available to be able to help set us up for that second half, because we have to execute a contract, all that kind of stuff, to be able to continue work into the second half of this year. So just want to state that at the top for those code super users that I know love giving us very excellent and detailed feedback. So with that, I'm going to start with the racial equity for framework for decision making. So these are the same. I gave this kind of same overview at the last discussion that we had on the model code, where there are really kind of 3 intersecting aspects of the framework for decision making that really intersect with the model code, specifically historical inequities, benefits and burdens, and accountability. And I wanted to take just a little bit extra time here because I don't feel like I set this up as well in the last meeting, and it didn't. The discussion wasn't, helpful for me in terms of setting up the discussion to really think about how these different components intersect with the model code. And in particular, one of the things I remember mentioning in terms of historical inequity, when we talk about development codes generally, they are, even just other types of development regulations generally, we are in a context of kind of, white supremacy and racial and economic segregation in the United States. And that is baked into our legal framework, that's baked into our regulatory structures, and anything that we develop in terms of like modern zoning codes, the model code, or any other types of codes that we develop and can administer in the United States is going to exist in that historical context. And I don't think I mentioned that very well. What I was hoping to do is to set this up to say, hey, we should have a discussion to think really critically about that context and how different ways that we structure development regulations can affect outcomes for historically marginalized groups. And I think where the conversation led, because of my failure to set this up adequately, is a little bit more of a black and white thinking of like, there's an equitable way to approach development code regulation and an inequitable way. And it's a little bit black and white. And that's I don't want to have that conversation again, right? I want to make sure that we're thinking very critically about anything we produce exists in that context, and we really need to think critically about those outcomes. And I think that involves a lot of thinking about benefits and burdens. We're going to have a lot of discussion today about trade-offs that exist in the model code, about different types of objectives that we're trying to achieve. So that's something I also think we should be very cognizant of and kind of tie to that historical inequities piece. And then, of course, we've also discussed this model code has an accountability function, both in terms of its statutory function in the actual acceleration program, right? It's a tool for compliance with different housing laws and compliance with housing acceleration agreements, which I know you guys have discussed. But it's also something that's going to need to be regularly updated. There's an accountability on the state side to ensure that it's an effective tool and achieves good outcomes. So I just want to set that up at the top before we get into discussion. So with that, as Deb mentioned, we're kind of dividing this conversation into three major parts. This first one, I'm going to start with kind of like an overview or context of the model code and start talking about, at a high level, what's in the model code, that type of thing. And really, the first part of the discussion, I want to focus on like, we know this code's going to need refinement. What should that look like, right? And then we'll move into a more specific part of the model code where we get into some tensions between some of the public policy objectives that we've talked about and ensuring that they are rightly balanced to ensure that the code also facilitates production and outcomes that we want to see. And then, of course, the third part of the discussion that we'll also talk about is in that broader Goal 10 implementation framework, right? We've talked a lot about adoption-ready actions that the model code can help inform, but how do we make sure that it's effective for that purpose, right? So I'm going to start with the first part of the question, like what does the next set of refinement look like in the second half of 2025? And I'll set us up with conversation about like what the model code looks like, and we'll take breaks or pauses in between each of these. So if you have questions, definitely save them for the end of this. We'll have ability to ask those as we get into discussion. So I'm going to start with a reminder just on the model code context. So this is something that we've talked about before. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it's just a useful reminder to note that we actually are not just doing this from scratch. We actually have very specific statutory direction that to DLCD and to the HAPO in the development and use of model codes. The most important of which that led this development of the model code is Senate Bill 1564, which direct us to produce model codes for 4 housing types, so detached single unit, ADUs, middle housing, multi-unit, for 3 different city sizes, basically small cities, medium cities, and large cities. And then, of course, to kind of stitch it together and to abide with other statutory requirements we have, we've also developed model procedures that help kind of implement that statute or implement the actual allowances of different housing types in the code. Now, statute has prescribed 3 very specific functions for model codes. The first one is just generally as guidance and promising practice to local governments to support housing production, affordability, and choice. We've talked about a lot about this in the context of Goal 10. We'll continue talking about it in the context of ARAs. But the second part has a more specific function for optional adoption and application by reference, especially for small cities, right? It's a tool that you can take if you really like a specific housing type, but you don't have the resources to develop code. The state provides this code that you can use optionally. And then, of course, it has a regulatory and compliance tool function. We've talked about one side of that with the LCDC enforcement order for the Housing Acceleration Program, which I'm not going to redetail. But there's also a role that HAPO has in developing these model codes to facilitate compliance with housing laws. And so this code is kind of like the first part of something that we're going to be developing additional modules to get at different housing laws that are being passed and have passed in the past to help support local implementation on the ground. So with that in mind, I also want to just emphasize, and again, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but just that we've had these conversations and we've had a lot of themes that have arisen in our discussion so far around, production, around different public policy objectives that we want to achieve, how we want this code to work, what outcomes it should get at, that we really sought to kind of operationalize in line with the commentary that you guys have provided to us and the written feedback that you provided to us to get at this draft code initially. Again, these are high level. I'm not saying that we're, these are binding or anything, but these definitely inform the first draft code along with the commentary you guys have provided this far. So with that, let's get into talking about the actual model code itself. I want to start right off at the top level. This is going to be a high level overview. I'm not going to talk about all the specific development standards, but more shoot at like what were the policy objectives and outcomes we were trying to achieve. So, obviously this is all detailed in the code itself. We have also a memo kind of summarizing some of the key highlights from each. I do want to start with a caveat about like what the model code is and isn't, because I noticed there was some confusion about what precisely the model code is going to do in some of our discussions. And, the statute is pretty specific about what we're supposed to produce and how it's supposed to be structured. So I want to start with like what the code is. It is a resource for local governments for supporting production. It sets a reasonable baseline for development that is much less restrictive than most modern development codes that allows a much broader breadth and range of housing types and allowances to make sure those housing types are feasible. And then it also incorporates an incentive structure to support additional flexibility. So in addition to that baseline, more flexibility and more housing that you can build in exchange for providing specific public policy goals, especially affordable and accessible housing. Now, what I want to emphasize that this code is not, it is actually, we've talked a lot about zoning and the kind of restrictive nature of zoning and disallowing housing choice in communities. This is actually not a zoning code. It doesn't regulate uses by geographic districts. It doesn't establish zones. It doesn't say what uses are allowed where. Anywhere this code applies, a housing type is allowed, right? The housing type that is, specified in the code is allowed in that geographic area, right? So it's not a zoning code. It doesn't prescribe where you can and cannot build stuff or different uses. But instead, it prescribes a specific set of standards for a given housing type, right? I also want to point out, it's not all development regulations that apply to development, right? So there's all types of peripheral aspects of development, things like public facilities, things like street standards, tree codes, goal protections, fire code, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that are important aspects that intersect with the development of housing. This code was not directed to produce any of that. So it does not include a lot of these. It defers to local standards that apply for those for any housing type that we built under this code. Now, of course, in the future, especially under the HAPA, as we develop new direction, there can be additional modules that we add. So if there's direction and funding to develop, say, a model street standard, that's something we can do in the future. So code is designed to be built upon over time. And then third, I want to also emphasize, we've been doing a lot of work to kind of make our codes congruous with DLCD model codes elsewhere. They're not 100% overlapping. Like this doesn't fully overlap with the CFEC walkability code, doesn't overlap fully with the small cities model code, which is currently being updated, or the manufactured prefabricated code or middle housing codes that were developed in 2020. But we did take a look at all of them to the extent that we could be congruous. We did seek to do that, but there's going to be places where they differ. They're going to be a little bit incongruous with each other because they serve different functions, right? So just keep that in mind as we get into it. All right. Oh, and I should add one more thing because this came up in an email to me. This also, we made a conscious decision that, sessions ongoing, there's a lot of bills that are currently under refinement by the legislative session. We did not try to incorporate all of those because that's like trying to hit a target that moves after you take a shot at it, right? So we are going to need to update it to align with different statutes. Brock pointed out one, Senate Bill 974. Obviously, there's the Middle Housing Bill, House Bill 2138. There's going to be other bills too that we will take a look at as the dust settles in legislative session to incorporate. All right. So just really quickly on the structure of the model code, it's a lot of chapters because it's basically a lot of housing types because middle housing is actually secretly 5 housing types. So basically right here, there are 4 kind of meta chapters, chapters 1, 8, 9, and 10 that are kind of like, how does this code function overall, right? And then there are chapters 2 through 7, which are code specific development standards that apply to individual housing types. We did our best to kind of consolidate standards where they're very similar to one another. But one thing I really want to point out is if you look at this document, you're like, wow, there's so many pages in here. It's a lot of regulation. It's actually not. It's because we have to segment these by different housing types. We have to provide different standards for different city sizes. That really expands the length. But if you were to develop any one of these housing types, the actual amount of applicable regulations to that development is basically just a couple of pages. So that's going to be a concept that we're going to talk about, that these regulations are actually very streamlined. Okay, so with that in mind, let's move on to talking about the model code in brief. We outlined this in the memo. Again, if you couldn't read the code and you had to kind of take away a few things that we really sought to kind of ingratiate in the code to ensure that it does, is basically these kind of main 3 points. Is the first one is that it's very permissive. Basically, anywhere this code applies, it allows all of the housing types in that code, and it allows it on any size lot. There's no restriction on the size of a lot that you can build any of the particular housing types, any existing lot, though there are some provisions around, if you're developing new lots or something like that. And I'll also add that intensity is really regulated by bulk and not density, right? So we're not restricting the number of housing units that you can build based on a density standard. I also want to add that this code is very streamlined. The siting and design standards that are applied to development are really, intended to be very permissive, right? To provide a very sufficient buildable envelope and really kind of hone down and limit the different standards that apply to ensure that we're facilitating very specific public policy objectives and not just for the sake of having kind of different regulations. There's going to need to be refinement on like what that level of streamlining includes, but for the most part, this is a very streamlined code, especially for housing types like multi-unit, which tend to have a lot of standards that are applied to them. I'll also add there's flexibility built into the code, and these are clear and objective flexibilities that are built into the code. Basically, we want to facilitate public policy objectives. So in addition to this kind of permissive baseline that we set up in the code, we also have additional kind of bonuses and flexibilities that are built in to achieve different objectives like affordable and accessible housing, obviously unit size variety, et cetera, things that we've talked about in the work group. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the second part of discussion. I'll also add, Brock, can you save your question for the end? Yeah. I'll also add that there's a bit of a gradient between kind of smaller cities and larger cities. We are directed to produce different standards for different size cities. And so one of the questions that we ask is how do we actually approach that, especially recognizing larger cities, it's more of a requirement. And for smaller cities, it's optional, right? Entirely optional. And so how do we balance that, right? And so the approach basically in kind of summary for large cities is generally more leaning into promising practice, really facilitating, providing very permissive baselines for development. And then for smaller cities, right, kind of balancing that with usability, right? So kind of ensuring that the standards are still very pro-housing. They're definitely much less restrictive than most codes that apply in small cities, but it kind of balances that with some flexibility built in there for small cities to ensure that it's actually useful, right? Because if small cities don't opt in, we've created this promising practice that nobody uses, and that's a waste of resources. So I'll just highlight that. And I want to talk about the actual individual standards themselves, again, at a very high level, just so you guys have an understanding of them. I also just included some pictures because pictures are fun. These are pictures I've taken myself or have gleaned from DLCD's like photo library. So, I would say I need to build on my photo library as I get into my role in the HAPO. But I'll start with detached single units and duplexes. This one's actually kind of tough to talk about because it's a very straightforward set of standards. There haven't been a set of statewide kind of model code standards that apply to detached single unit other than the small cities model code. And really what we sought to do in this is basically just align our existing approach for duplexes with detached single units. It has a pretty simple set of development and design standards that apply to it. And we build in kind of incentives to build in additional units to make additions to existing units, things like that, to facilitate that policy outcome of size diversity. I'll also add kind of an accessory to that is we have accessory dwelling units. I'll also apologize. I have very few photos of accessory dwelling units because I don't really go into people's backyards to take photos. But I want to just emphasize this kind of correlates or is ingratiated with the detached single units and duplexes. And basically the approach that we took here was to allow in large cities 2 attached or detached ADUs pretty permissively. We really sought to kind of facilitate, especially for like an existing property owner or an inexperienced developer, to make additions to an existing site with an ADU particularly easy. And that includes establishing a flat site cap of 1,000 square feet per ADU. And that is independent of the primary unit. There's no kind of proportion of the size of an ADU compared to the primary unit. And really also building in an incentive to encourage unit retention by basically guaranteeing a minimum of 1,000 square feet of floor area. So if you're a homeowner and you're looking to add an ADU to your property, there isn't going to be a development or a dimensional standard that restricts your ability to do that, right? So really trying to facilitate making that addition of an ADU to an existing house very easy. All right, moving on to kind of the middle housing side of this. A lot of this draws from existing model codes that we were required to develop for House Bill 2001 in 2019. And basically the kind of takeaways from this is that there's a higher intensity than is allowed in the middle housing model codes. It does allow a much more configuration flexibility for different public policy goals like unit retention, building small units, building accessible units, things like that. And then, of course, we also added in a model middle housing land division procedure, right? So this is something that's supposed to be a resource for local governments that may not have that on the books. Just a quick note on these pictures. These are pictures I took of myself of middle housing that's actually being built now that it's been legalized. A very fun note, this unit on the left here, this is a triplex on a 2,500 square foot lot that I'm actually going to be closing on in about a week here. The back unit of this triplex is something that I am purchasing, and it was made affordable basically through a lot of the zoning reforms that have happened in the city of Portland. So I just want to say a testament to the power that some of these changes can have. And I did check against the model code. This triplex is allowed under this model code based on the dimensional and design standards that are allowed under there. So trying to really facilitate that flexibility. All right, I'm going to talk about multi-unit really quickly. And one thing I really want to set up here is when we talk about multi-unit, we actually had to make a pretty important set of decisions around what are we optimizing for, because multi-unit consists of actually a humongous spectrum of different ways of constructing apartments, basically, right? And they really kind of depend on how much land costs and how much construction costs, and they have very different economic contexts. And right, there's a spectrum all the way from like wood framed apartments that are built very similarly to detached single unit dwellings that have very low construction costs, all the way up to like tower concrete and steel, lots of specialized labor and construction costs that go into that type of style development. And we made a very deliberate choice in this model code to really focus on the lower end of that spectrum. We're really focusing on optimizing for wood framed construction in particular. I should note the code actually does allow you to get into podium especially like if you're an affordable housing developer with the bonus structure that we have in play. But we're not trying to optimize for that, mostly because we know that wood framed apartments, because of its low construction costs, are actually a housing type that pencils in a very significant proportion of the state. Even in smaller communities or more rural communities, wood framed apartments can very much pencil. Whereas the higher, these other construction typologies get much more difficult, except in places where real estate values are really, really high, right? And I also wanted to point out basically the approach for how this code was structured was really thinking about, okay, among wood framed apartments, we're optimizing for wood framed apartments, but there's different types, or I wouldn't say types, but like a spectrum of formats for what wood framed apartments can take in terms of their urban form. And basically you can kind of divide it into, this isn't the best typology, but kind of two major ends of a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum is kind of more towards this small lot or infill type apartments. This is an apartment that I took a picture of on a bike ride that was recently built in my neighborhood. And basically they're wood framed apartments. They take up most of the lot. They tend to require a higher intensity and land's much more at a premium, right? So they need to generally consume much more of the lot and have less room for other types of things. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's this kind of more large lot or garden style apartment that basically has more room for activities. It's a lower intensity. It might still be 3 stories, but there's a lot of other space for things like open space, playgrounds, community amenities, or, obviously off-street parking. And generally speaking, have a much lower intensity. And basically the way that this code was structured, and this was very intentional, is to kind of differentiate between these ends of the spectrum to enable different levels of intensity based on the context, the economic context for which the wood framed apartment's being built. If you're doing this on a small lot, you need a lot more space, right, for the actual units itself. Whereas in a larger lot, you don't need as much of that. So, right, you can support this typology that has more space for other types of things, including open space, usable open space, things like that. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit just about the refinement that we need to do. So we have this kind of baseline that we've established in code that's pretty permissive, but also all these numbers are tentative. They haven't been stress tested yet, right? And that's something that we think is very important to do. We want to make sure that once we deliver this final code at the end of it, that different unit types are actually feasible on the ground, right? And so one of the big important pieces that we'll need to do in the second half of this year is going through a process to actually refine this, to test this, to ensure that production is feasible under the code, the standards that are produced under this. And so one of the things that we wanted to talk about in today's discussion is what that approach looks like. So far, we basically kind of brainstormed 3 major ways that we want to take of calibrating this code and getting to a refined draft that will be available later this year. The first one is to look at actual examples of housing production that have happened on the ground, right? For example, that triplex, right? I tested it against the code to make sure, like, would this actually be possible? And yes, it is. We should do that for a lot of different contexts, right? In small cities, in larger cities, right? To ensure that different housing types can actually pencil in different markets. We also want to take takeaways. We've been doing a number of housing feasibility and market studies, both through the climate friendly work as well as through other work that we've been doing on the work group here on the HOG. We want to take takeaways from this existing work to kind of inform what does that mean in terms of our model code for ensuring and supporting production on the ground. And then, of course, I think this is just important. We should have conversations and discussions with the people who are implementing it, with developers, with local governments, to talk through, the barriers that they experience in development codes at facilitating production, and how our model code can be a resource to help that. So with that in mind, I kind of want to pivot to discussion. I know I took a little bit of time here to set up that context. I promise the second parts of the presentation will be a little bit shorter than this, but let's pivot into the actual discussion questions that we have. So, like, kind of with that context, right, we talked about the baseline of the model code. We talked about some of the high level pieces, and we're going to talk about some of the details. That's totally fine in today's discussion. But where we really want to focus this question is on that method for calibration. How do we, in the second half of this year, start to stress test this, to start working on feasibility, those different types of pieces, to ensure that calibration occurs and that production is going to be feasible under this code? That's a big question that we want to ask. And Deb, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add before we actually get into facilitated discussion.
Just one other thing. I've invited Sean, of course, and the rest of the project team have been working on this, Kathy Corliss, Kate Rogers, and Becky Hewitt, to also chime in with questions they may have of you or clarifications needed. And with that, I just want to acknowledge there are now 2 Kathys in the room, so I'll try to use your last names. One is a HOG member, Kathy Wild, one is our team member. So I think that's it. Let's get going. Oh, one other thing, you will also have noted that we didn't have like a general clarifying questions section. So, but if you do have some other questions about the code, please go ahead and voice those now as well. And the team will do their best to respond here, but it might also need follow-up if we can't respond right away. Okay, Brock.
Yeah, and I think I can be quick on this one. As far as one, just Sean, can you remind me which statute requires large cities to use model code? It's not a position question, just for information.
Yeah, so the requirement for large cities to use the model code, so there's kind of 2 contexts. One is basically with the LCDC enforcement order, right? So if we've talked about the acceleration program before. Basically, at the end of the process, there's an agreement to take actions within respective control to reduce barriers to production. And if that agreement is violated or never entered, the next step is an enforcement order, and the model code is applied directly to development as kind of a developer's remedy. Does that make sense? So basically what would happen is all the provisions in this model code, like the ministerial review processes, the allowances that are provided in the model code, it would be an option for developers if applied by LCDC. The second context, it's not exactly a requirement, but we've talked about adoption ready actions, right? Like, what can cities do to ensure that they're implementing Goal 10? This model code can inform that, right? So in contrast to small cities where they're not required to do any of that, right? So anything in this code is 100% optional. They can take it or leave it, right?
Okay, cool. And then second, just about the calibration testing, and this kind of falls into the conversations with developers and local governments. Is there any discussion about HPAC taking a look at this at some point?
The Housing Production Advisory Committee?
Yeah, I know they'd have to probably be reconvened to do it, but
I have no direction from the governor's office to do that, but I'm open to. Is a representative from the governor's office here?
I don't see Spatha or anyone else from Geo here. No.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question.
Yeah, again, similar, just thought, but thanks.
What I should add is we do want to very specifically get developers, local government representatives in discussion, right? And that could include HPAC members. I know a lot of them do have development experience, so that's going to be an important part of this. So if we want to talk about that, that's great.
All right, thank you. Karen.
All right. Thank you very much for the presentation. There was a lot there. And so I did take some time beforehand. So as the long range planning manager, I don't work with our code on a daily basis, but I did sit down with Martha Fritzy, who does on a daily basis work with our code and go through some of the materials. And so in response to the question, which was about the method for calibration, right? I think that there should be space, clear space, for the ability to loop back with kind of jurisdictional professionals to be able to have them look at the code. I think right now, not just on the private sector, but on the public sector. I do want to highlight, I think this is the time to highlight this. One of the things that's talked about for the one of the primary purposes is to be able to have this, I think it was said, a reasonable baseline for development with less restrictions than most codes. So one of the things that we wanted to highlight was that for a jurisdiction with Clackamas County, some of there's actually more restrictions, especially as you look at the single family, right? So I think as we're calibrating and looking really closely, making sure that this actually is less restrictions and kind of more simple to implement than what we have now. So I think that was one of the kind of initial reactions, is making sure that we're true to that, that this is less restriction instead of more restriction.
Great. Thank you, Karen, and thank you all for sort of doing a little bit of a stress test. Yeah, Becky.
I just had a follow-up question for Karen. I don't know if you have details on this, and you could drop them in the chat if that's easier, but I would be curious if you could give a couple examples of areas of the code that you saw as more restrictive than what you have on the books today.
Yeah, well, let's see. So one of the things that we were noticing, and while there are like entry orientation requirements, and we may have some of those, we in Clackamas County do not have as many design restrictions on single family as other jurisdictions would have. But I think that was one that sort of rose up to the top, and how we can really address that with one of the issues that we've had in the past actually has to do with sort of irregular shaped lots and how to apply these various guidance on something that's not just a rectangle. I think the other, and I know in the memos, it talked about this as one of the questions, but it had to do with like requiring the paved surface from the front door to the sidewalk. I think that's very new and would be very different. And whether or not that should be, an additional requirement. I think those were the two things off the top of my head, but we probably, given enough time, I don't think the intent with regards to the comments that are due on Monday is to have that level of detail, but I think those types of details should be talked about with the kind of the whole set of maybe a group of jurisdiction, like planners.
Yeah.
And what their perception is.
Sure. Can I ask a question, actually, or maybe highlight a tension that exists? So one of the kind of deliberate things that we did in this kind of initial draft, and again, there's going to need to be more calibration that happens, is thinking about, okay, well, what is the effectuating purpose of a standard that we are applying to development? Like, what's the public policy objective that we're trying to achieve, right? And so one of the big things that we did in this code is we thought to take a look at design standards, and we're like, okay, well, we have some in the model code, we have some, in the middle housing model code, et cetera, but what does this actually help us achieve? And how do we balance that with this broader vision of production, right? And so like, basically a big change that happened in a lot of these design standards is focusing less on those standards that are less connected to a very specific public benefit. I think a great example of this are like aesthetic design regulations. There's very few as like purely aesthetic design regulations in this code, and more focusing on like, well, we've heard from the work group that we should emphasize walkability and access to community amenities. Can you do that if you don't have walkable design? I don't know. if you allow a rectangle right on a particular lot. So that was part of the impotence for including some of those like baseline design standards that provide some options and flexibilities in design configuration, but still get at a public purpose behind there. So that's kind of the balance that we're trying to strike. Again, I think it's going to need some refinement to be like, is this the right standard at getting us towards this objective? Is there a different way of achieving that? Does this create maybe problems, right, that we should address somehow? And that's going to be part of that process.
Great, thank you. Thank you for bringing some real world examples to the table as well, Karen. Anyone else have thoughts on calibration methods and options? Yeah, Anne.
Yeah, well, first I had a question. I noticed that you specify the medium cities as applying to 10,000 or less, and it doesn't, I mean, you put that in there specifically, maybe because it doesn't line up with the medium cities definition, but there's an inconsistency between medium cities and.
Yeah, can I speak to that? Sorry,
yeah.
this is because the term medium cities, the definition has changed over time. So originally it used to mean cities above 10,000. It actually now means cities above 2,500 because HB 3395 changed the definition of like who's applicable for duplex regulations to cities between, greater than 2,500 in population. And of course, there's cities that are 25,000 in population or greater, or cities in the metro. And of course, that includes unincorporated components of Washington and Clackamas and Multnomah counties that are large cities. But the small cities is the same. It's less than 2,500.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just wanted to check on that, and then I will provide detailed comments as I think through all the pieces. But I was carefully looking at the maximum floor area ratios, the definition of floor area ratio, especially for multi-dwelling unit development. Like the maximum floor area ratio is 1:1 for sites over 50,000 square feet for large cities, and that's kind of restrictive, in my opinion, if you're in an urban area. And one thought I had, and again, I'll have more detailed comments, but if you've got a natural resource protection area on a site, that maybe should be excluded from the base of the floor area ratio, or if it helps, I mean, I'm used to thinking a minimum floor area ratio, not maximum. So I've got to think through my comments and thinking about the definition in use for maximum floor area ratio. And then I was looking at the lot sizes. Again, I'm mostly focusing on large city stuff, but Sean, didn't you say your triplex is on a 2,500 square foot lot?
Yeah, and it actually would be allowed under this code too. It's new lots that have a size restriction. We can actually talk about that once we get to the flexibility.
Okay, well, because triplex, it's a minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet. So I was just kind of like that doesn't work for a new lot, but because it was an existing lot. But if you think about, the ability to do a triplex on a 2,500 square foot lot, I mean, in new development, what makes sense. We've reduced lot sizes for smaller dwellings and in Albany, because we know the 5,000 square foot lot is too large. But I haven't had a chance to look at all the different bonus provisions and check it back. But I do think carefully looking at the floor area ratio maximums for certain housing types. And I was also looking at the setbacks already. So if you take a 10,000 square foot lot and you have 5-foot setbacks and build it out, you're already using up this much space. And I don't know. But anyway, I was just kind of looking at all that.
Can I add a couple of things just to respond to some of the points? So first, on that minimum lot size question, that's actually one of the questions that we asked in that detailed, like the supplemental questionnaire. Can you please respond to that in writing?
Yeah.
Because that's one of the things we're like, hey, this code allows a housing type on any size lot, but it does establish these provisions to provide a reasonable baseline for new lots. Is that something we should do, right? Or should it just be, you can develop any size lot, no matter what it is, and put whatever housing type you can fit on there? That's also an approach that we could take. So that's one of the questions that we ask. And just in terms of multi-unit development, kind of similar, I think there's a similar question in there too. Basically, that calibration is between different typologies that we see on different size sites. On a 50,000 square foot site or bigger, right, you're talking about a pretty big site that generally, right, you often see in maybe more kind of suburban context, right? They tend to come with more space between buildings, right? For things like parking or playgrounds or whatever it is. And so those are calibrated basically based on the size of a site size. So if you have, say, for example, that kind of small lot infill context for multi-unit development, it allows a much greater amount or intensity of development that would enable kind of taking advantage of the full site that you have available to you. So that's
Yeah.
one of the provisions that's kind of integrated in the code.
Yeah, I understand that. I'll kind of look at some example developments down, here to look at that. I just feel like you can have, 5-acre, 8-acre sites, which, we are a large city, but we still have maybe, even though we might have 4-story buildings, we may be challenged. And we are providing parking, but in cities that don't need to provide as much parking, like Eugene or whatever, where you've got a more robust transportation system, I just am a little concerned about some of the FARs for multi-dwelling units. So I'll run some tests and just give you guys some examples, but it's going to be really hard for me to get all of that to you by Monday. Tomorrow's a
That's
holiday
great.
anyway, but I'll try to see if somebody else can help look up some stuff, but I will, provide
if I can make
specific comments in writing back. I
Yeah.
just wanted to flag a few issues.
If I can
on
make a
this.
suggestion, don't
Mhm.
worry about getting us everything. The main thing that we're looking for is just initial reactions, written responses, places where we think we're going to need to focus for 2025, and then you can get the more detailed examples, because that's when the calibration, soliciting case examples, that's when that's going to happen. So that would be very helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Appreciate that. And thanks, Sean, for some additional clarity. Michael.
Hey, yeah, I wanted to make a general point, just that anything like to what Karen was saying, if anything in the model code would force, especially the smaller jurisdictions, to start tracking and regulating things that they don't already, that seems like a problem. Like, it just seems like the model code should be simple enough that nobody has to start regulating anything that they're not already regulating, ideally, just as a rule of thumb, I guess.
Michael, that would require us to read like 200 development codes.
I understand that. I'm just saying that that's a that's
Like,
not
I don't
something
know
you
how
can
to, I don't know how
achieve.
to respond to that.
No, I realize that would be difficult, but that's something to keep in mind as a goal. And if you hear about it, to be like, whoa, alarm bells, the city of Tillamook has no capacity to assess this, right?
Can you give us an example?
I don't know. I like Karen mentioned entrances, something about like regulating the way that the placement of entrances. If the code review folks don't currently look at that at all, then that would
Can I
be.
ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Should this code just be a box on a lot? Like that is an approach we could take. This is one of the tensions that we have in the kind of that we're going to talk about in the next discussion
Yeah.
question. But like, we can do that, right? We can just say you have a box and this is as big as it is and nothing else.
Right.
And maybe have some standards around like driveway configuration if they just elect to provide a driveway.
Maybe there's some other opinions from these other people. I'm not sure. I guess I tend to think that that is the common factor in almost every zoning code. And so that is the thing that we are looking for, at least in my mind, to a generally lighter touch on zoning codes than the status quo is.
It
right?
is. It very much is.
Right, exactly.
I read codes for a living. It very much, I could say like it's a very
No, I
simplified set
understand
of
that
standards.
piece by piece this is. It also introduces, in some cases, new dimensions of regulation. And so that's what I'm saying, that like that is something to be cautious about.
Thank you. Becky, additional thoughts or comments on that?
Just one other follow-up on that, Michael. I wanted to call out the example of floor area ratio as one in particular that I know a lot of smaller jurisdictions do not use, and often, and even medium-sized jurisdictions, sometimes it feels like too complicated or hard to understand, and there's sometimes reticence to use floor area ratio as a tool. Many of them right now use units per acre, and I think you're well aware of some of the issues with using units per acre to regulate And so I guess I'm curious about that specific example where it is something that we know many jurisdictions do not currently have experience with. They may not have a comfort level with measuring that and regulating it. But if the alternative is to stick with things they already regulate, that leaves us with the tools of density and minimum lot size that are, kind of more have other problems, right? Have problems relative to achieving some of the policy goals. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that specific, how we regulate the quantity of development side. I think what you were saying was maybe more in the like, not forcing them to regulate design elements or that they don't currently regulate. But I'm curious about that, how you would apply that thinking to floor area ratio versus density and minimum lot size.
I think that the folks who work for local governments are better qualified than I am to weigh in on this, but it seems to me that you could say that you could say that there's very liberal restrictions on lot size per unit, just as easily as you could say use FAR instead. So I guess I don't see that as like an inherent problem.
The problem is we have to choose one for the model code, right?
Right.
You can't apply two different and like choose which development standards apply. That doesn't function. The code wouldn't serve its function if we did that.
Sure. I mean, in theory, you could say that a city could choose between these two. Is that correct? No,
No.
there's no way to have
No.
that option because
Yeah,
the
because
function
if
of the model
this
code
is applying as a
this is
developer's
model code
remedy,
that will work.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I also, Becky, did wonder about the like, why do we need both height and FAR in multifamily?
That could
Usually,
be an
like,
option.
yeah, we've
Yeah.
considered saying that, like, we've put pitching laws in various states that say you can either regulate FAR or footprint height, but not both. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think you kind of answered this with Michael's question, but so if a city opts in to adopt the model code, it's not done through enforcement. Is there the ability, and again, this is just clarifying, for a city to say like, hey, we're adopting the model code with the exception of this? Right?
Yeah. If a city's opting in, and we'll need to write a rule kind of clarifying more specifically how it's function. We talk a little bit about some of its functionality in the code. The city decides where it applies, right? So if they say, like, let's say, for example, a city wants to allow ADUs in a particular area, but they're not required to. They would have this code that they could then apply. They could specify, all right, we're going to put it in these zones, or we're going to put it in this area, or this overlay that we're providing. And then it's an option, right? So an applicant could choose to apply those standards, or they could apply whatever the local standards are. They could choose to not have the model code. There's also a little bit of flexibility built in there, in kind of two ways, one for the local government and one for the applicant. For the applicant, they have the ability, like, let's say there's a second set of ADU standards, and maybe there's a less restrictive standard in there that would allow for more housing. They can choose to apply that, right? So that's one of the general provisions in the code. And then the second piece, that's flexibility for cities, especially for cities that aren't required to do certain things. Like if they're not required to allow ADUs, they're not required to allow duplexes. We have some standards in there that are recommended, which enable that city, if they choose to opt in, this is the default standard, but you can adjust it if you want to adjust it to local preferences and priorities to kind of recognize that all these different cities have different contexts, different political priorities, that kind of thing. But we still want to provide a recommended standard. So that's how that flexibility is built into the code and gives small cities that aren't required to adopt it options to make it more usable.
Okay. And then second question. So we have, and this is a little bit along the line of Michael's as well. You got the FAR, right? You have your lot development standards, setbacks and things like that. Height, and then density as well. How is that kind of applied? Because the way that I'm reading it, and I've tried to get through as much of the model code as I can, but I will admit that I do not know it perfectly yet. So we're going through, right? Let's say that we meet all the development standards, we meet the FAR, the height, et cetera, et cetera. The density, and part of what I'm looking at is on page 81 here, and then I'm going to reference the table on page 7 of the code just as an example. So for minimum density, right, it's calculating this, and it says net site area, minimum area per dwelling unit in tables 2.1 through 6.1. And then when you reference that table, it says the minimum density shown is the equivalent of 8 units an acre, which I believe comes from the FAR. Like that, the minimum density being, so like for the example on page 7 for single family and duplex, this one minimum equates to 8 units an acre, but I think that equation is based on FAR. Is that right?
Kathy,
Or that math?
No. Kathy, Kate, do you guys want to speak to this?
Yeah, I think there's some confusion. It's min density, not max density. So
Oh, sorry. Apologies if I was saying max.
but I think that
Got it.
yeah, so it's meant to help avoid somebody underbuilding, right?
Right. Yeah.
And because the standards otherwise would have no way to preclude that. And so the goal was to set a relatively low min density, and also to recognize that underbuilding on a constrained site is different than underbuilding on a fully developable site. So that's why it's the net site area.
Okay, got it. So that 8 units an acre would essentially be like the low end of the. Okay, no.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I'm right. I know it's a little different, right?
But yeah, I got what you're saying. Thank you.
great. All right, Anne, let's take your comment or question, and then I'm going to move us on to the next discussion. Go ahead.
Sure. I was just going to give the floor area ratio comment that Becky asked for in response to Michael's suggestion to hear from local government. We don't use floor area ratio in Albany. We're 57,000 in population. We use height and maximum lot coverage, or you could flip that around to the minimum open space or whatever requirements. When you look at the setbacks, the minimum setbacks already, provide, some area that is not covered by building, but it doesn't really allow for much landscaping. So anyway, we don't use floor area ratio.
And can I ask a question? Do you regulate maximum density? Does the city of Albany regulate?
Well, we have minimum density in our medium and higher density zones, in our residential zones. We don't regulate it in, we don't have maximum densities. We just regulate minimum density in the RM and greater zones, and we don't regulate minimum density in our mixed use zones. Actually, we might in the mixed use commercial.
But like in your apartment zones, do you regulate the maximum number of units you can build?
No, we used to, but we removed that because we really need 1-bedroom units, for example. And if the building is the same height, shape, size, and it's 3 bedrooms versus 1 bedrooms, let's just look at scale. And then scale translates to, I think, design standards and ensuring that we, have some, that we're not just building boxes or whatever. But we're looking at just height and lot coverage.
Right. So there's different ways that you can regulate intensity. So the approach that you're referring to, this is common in a lot of zoning codes, where you essentially establish a building envelope that is a hypothetical box based on the confluence of different dimensional standards that apply to that. So if you take all the setbacks, you take the height restrictions into play, you take the lot coverage restrictions into play, you take any other kind of constraining factors that are associated on that, you end up with this hypothetical box that is the thing that the development can take up on. And basically a lot of oftentimes there's also the addition of density that can also regulate the intensity of development, though imperfectly, as you kind of touched on. And it's good to remove that. But the question is, when you're regulating intensity, you can replace a lot of those. Like, for example, there's no lot coverage requirement in the model code, right? It replaces that regulation of intensity of, density, lot coverage, et cetera, with an FAR, right? And so that could be a shift in approach, right? We could say, hey, maybe FAR isn't the approach of regulating intensity. And instead, we should make that hypothetical box based on a mixture of what the setbacks, what the height, what the build. I mean, do we even regulate building lot coverage? Because we don't currently. Like we could do it that way too. And so that would be an interesting kind of question on calibration that I would ask the group.
I think it's a lot simpler, just for applicability across jurisdictions of all sizes.
Okay, thank you. It's good to hear sort of how you all are managing that. Michael, go ahead. Oh, Kathy, hang on one second, Michael. Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, just follow-up question for Anne, and I guess for others. One of the advantages that we thought we saw with FAR versus lot coverage and height is that it allows you to kind of identify, or it doesn't bias against single story. So as part of our kind of thinking about accessibility, especially in lower density types of housing, FAR seem to offer a ability to kind of control the massing, but not necessarily bias against a single story unit, which of course we're not seeing as many of. And so that was something that was on our mind as we're thinking about, again, and some of the standards that are in place were reflecting our interest in emphasizing accessibility, so the pathways and those kinds of things, as well as the walkable design. So thoughts on that would be really welcome as you're commenting on it.
Yeah, because I also want to emphasize too, we're also taking those other dimensional standards and we're making them a lot less restrictive, right? Height's way less restrictive. Setbacks are way less restrictive, like than most development codes. There's no lot size coverage standard, right? So if we're asking the question, how do we regulate massing? This initial draft code was like, okay, well, we'll have FAR to ensure that there's this kind of relative scale and intensity of development that is commensurate with different neighborhoods, right? And provide this kind of point that Kathy raises around not biasing around different development typologies. If we take that away, we could just say the biggest rectangle you can fit on this piece of land. We can say that. That is an option. But is that what we want?
I'm going to pop to Ethan real quick and thank you, Michael, for your continued patience. Thanks. Go ahead, Ethan.
Thanks, Deb. Actually, yeah, feel free to go to Michael and Julia, and I'll go after.
Okay, great. Michael, you're up.
Just real quick, I just didn't want the main thrust of my comment to be interpreted as FAR versus lot coverage height. I don't know which is better. My main point is just be careful about forcing cities to come up with like new things they need to look at. It's just, that's all.
Got it. Thank you. Julia.
Yeah, I figured I'd jump in real quick on the notes around kind of trying to aim these towards making sure we're providing opportunities for accessibility and accessible units. So one of the things I just wanted to flag is the requirements around entry locations and the distance from lot lines related to that, especially in kind of the smaller scale developments. One thing I used to run into all the time when I was doing that scale development in inner and northeast Portland in particular is when the lots are above grade. You run into a lot of really complicated things around creating accessible entries, especially when you're trying to wedge that entry into a very small box in terms of what the code is telling you to do. So I think I know that's like nearly impossible to calibrate like slopes and things like that and like all those things in a model code, but I just kind of want to flag that as maybe a piece that gets thought about and maybe defined better in the model code to kind of acknowledge that tension that can exist with those types of priorities.
And we were grappling with that same tension and think that's an area of needed refinement. Kathy, do you want to speak to some of the things that we did? Again, it's not perfect, but I think we can build on this.
Yeah, we did think about that. And I think one of the areas that I hope that we get to explore in the next draft is more of a robust adjustments process that would be built in. So I think that, that's going to let us more easily recognize variations in individual lots. So I think kind of across the board, we can calibrate as best we can, but every lot is individual, right? We all know that. So, our goal would be to have standards that work, 85% of the time, but there's always going to be outliers. And so solving for that, I think is going to be a really important part of the overall solution.
And if I can add,
I think
we
that's
did do
really
some of
important.
that too. Like we
Yeah.
did incorporate certain provisions around like based on the grade or, like the slopes or based on, if you're providing like an accessible pathway or et cetera, to provide flexibility, especially specifically in that case, because we knew that was a challenge.
Yeah, there was one part, and shoot, I should have been pulling up the parts I had highlighted for this while you guys were responding, but there was one part that I just flagged in terms of where it was something, especially with like, I think the townhome provision in particular, which was like requiring like all entrances to be within a certain distance from the lot line and those types of things where it's just like, again, it starts to get a little complicated both for accessibility, but also you start to limit like entrances facing the side of the lot and things like that that just again provide a lot of flexibility for a variety of different kind of both culturally specific things and accessibility on units.
Actually, Julia, this was a point of confusion for us in the reading and writing the code. Kate, do you want to speak to that a little bit more? The code doesn't require entrances to be within a certain distance of the parent lot line, but it does have standards for the entrances that end up there.
I'm not sure exactly which standard you're referencing, Julia, but we did go back and forth on, because I think the middle housing model code for HB 2001 had some specific sort of lot width provisions related to like driveway access. I don't know if those aren't necessarily tied to the entry orientation, but the intent was that you could have townhome development where the units are kind of oriented, perpendicular to the street. So it's not necessarily all sort of row house style where all the units are facing the street. So that is the intent. Whether that's perfectly reflected in the code, is to be determined, but we'll work
I'll
on
find the
that.
specific reference and send it just maybe as a note of just need for clarity if that was the intent. So that's good to hear though.
I can say the distinct intent was because townhouses originally before the middle housing land division were thought of as needing to face the street, right? Because that was the common development typology. Middle housing land division threw that out the window for plexes basically that were constructed in a townhouse style. So one of the things we sought to do was to enable those, townhouse entrances that don't front the street, right? Like they are, to the side, like that triplex that I mentioned that I'm doing. That's needs to be a possible configuration for townhouses. And where there are units that do get close to the street, there's certain standards around how they're oriented.
Thanks for flagging, Julia, and for the follow-up. Ethan, please.
Thanks. And it was actually great that Michael and Julia went just before me. And I think one of the fundamental questions here in the development of this model code is like, it's used in these different scenarios. It's used in a resource scenario to provide guidance to local governments who might be interested in, thinking differently about their regulations and using, this model code, adopting by reference, and all of the things that purpose serves. But it also serves the purpose of this kind of more enforcement regulatory perspective. And you can't really build the code to focus only on one of those items, and it has to be both. And the unifying element of both of those use cases is around what is the promising practice, what is going to be an advancement of the, a more permissive or more like housing production focused element of, development codes. And so, this is like the discussion around this particular topic using FAR as an example is a really good test case for like if the model code is going to be used in like a guidance adoption perspective and a city does not regulate now by FAR, they don't have to use that particular portion of the code. They can adopt it by reference in part. It's not in whole, and they can use it kind of like plug and play almost. But in a more enforcement regulatory perspective, it is important to lean into those like policy goals, policy objectives, and identify a set of standards that are promising practices, even if those standards are not the standards of the day in a particular local government. Because if it's going to be applied in an enforcement scenario, there's a good reason why we're trying to remove particular barriers to achieve particular outcomes. So I just wanted to kind of highlight like the approach is intentionally around promising practices, almost like this is an overgeneralization and probably too simplified, but almost without regard to like the standards that are happening in a particular local government, because they're focused solely on like what is promising, what is achieving these outcomes. And that's like what can unify both the guidance of it and also the enforcement of it.
If I can just add on that, Ethan, I think like I'll just focus on FAR, but this applies in other contexts too. It's like when it comes to regulation, right, and regulating housing development, right, we have a status quo that really restricts housing development in most communities, in most land in the state, right? I've read the codes. I can say definitively they're very restrictive. The question then is like, in the case of like FAR, it's like, well, okay, what is a reasonable way of regulating intensity of development, right? If it's not maximum density, which we say maximum density is not a reasonable way to regulate intensity of development, as well as those kind of restrictive dimensional standards, restrictive setbacks, height, building lot coverage, et cetera. What is a reasonable way to regulate intensity? And our answer to that in this draft was the FAR. The answer could also be there is no reasonable way to restrict the intensity of development. That's a much different like policy statement, right? And it's also saying like there is no promising practice on regulating intensity of development because it's not something you should do. That's a different policy statement, right? And so there's also questions about that with the design standards, right? I see a lot of design standards that are very complex, really regulate very intensely the aesthetics of development and provide very little flexibility on configuration of options. Now, if folks are asking, well, then what's a reasonable way of regulating design? Our answer can be there is no reasonable way of regulating design, or it can be here's a set of standards that get at different public policy outcomes related to walkability, related to trees, protection from harm, et cetera, things we've talked about. But not those other types of standards that make really restrictive things around aesthetics, private open space, et cetera, et cetera. So if we don't have an answer for that, right, what is the reasonable way to regulate design? What is the reasonable way to regulate intensity? Our answer is there is no reasonable way to do that, that's maybe something we should have a conversation about, right? Because that would be different than what our understanding was in talking with the work group even a couple of months ago.
All right, food for thought. Thank you, Ethan, for the reminder too of the sort of dual purpose we're hitting here and why things are headed one way or another. Let's take a break. It's a little early, but I know the next topic, which is around bonuses and flexibility, has a lot to be discussed, and I want to make sure we have time for that. So let's take 10 minutes till let's take 11 minutes. We'll go to 10:30 and then reconvene for the discussion. So grab your coffee or water or whatever you need, and I'll see you in 11. Thanks. All right, welcome back. Thank you. Hi, Shannon. Welcome back. Thanks for letting me know you're there. All right. Thank you all for the initial discussion. The next one, Sean's gonna give us a little overview and line us out on the sort of draft approach and some options or questions on the table about setting baselines and then bonuses within code. So with that, I will hand it to you, Sean, to take it away.
Great. And yeah, thank you, Deb. And one thing I'll add, I think we've actually been touching a lot on this conversation already so far, about what this tension is. So I think we're good. We'll talk about this a little bit more, or hone the conversation a little bit more on like the specific bonus and flexibility structure that was provided. We have a summary of it that's actually provided in the materials to kind of articulate what that looks like. But basically, there is kind of a tension in a spectrum about basically what we think the purpose of different development regulations are, right? So something I just kind of want to emphasize right at the top of this conversation when we get into this, there's an underlying philosophical question that we're not going to reconcile in today's discussion, which is what is the purpose of a regulation? This is something that involves people's values. It involves their like what they actually think the purpose of different aspects of like development and government and the intersection of those different things in our lives and what these things achieve, that we are not going to reconcile. We all have different values on that, and that's okay. But we did have to choose an approach for the purpose of the model code. And one thing I really wanted to highlight is a bit of a tension that can happen in different areas as we kind of go into that. And we've talked about a lot of these tensions so far, which is that when it comes to the model code, we're trying to balance a series of public policy objectives, right? One of those public policy objectives is that we want to facilitate production. And we want to do that because that's one of the main objectives of this code. And it's also important because the production is the catalyst for achieving any other public policy provisions, right? If you have a code that is overly regulated, you're not going to achieve other public policy provisions because nothing happens, right? But at the same time, we've also talked about a number of public policy objectives. We want affordable housing. We want accessible housing. We want housing that is close to community amenities. We want people to be protected from harm, say, for example, adjacent to like freeways or where they could be exposed to particulate matter or pollution. We want folks to have access to generally, like common open space, right? Have access to like trees and the infrastructure needed to withstand extreme heat events. We want like unit size variety. We want to incentivize small units. We want to incentivize variety in bedroom count. We want to incentivize like all these different types of things that we want to achieve in the code. And these are public policy objectives that can often align with production, but there are also times where they can be in tension with one another, right? Especially where there involves kind of a trade-off. I'll talk about one very specific example that I think is going to be very important in the context of this code. But one of the things I want to mention is that we have to talk about this in the context of a spectrum, right? There is, I think we've talked a lot about like, hey, we are going from a status quo that has struck a particular balance between public policy and production, and it has unintended consequences. It is artificially reducing the amount of housing that we can produce, maybe sometimes for not the most compelling reasons, right? So we need to change that status quo, and we need to replace it with things that are getting at different public policy objectives. However, there is another end of this. There are kind of two extremes of a spectrum in terms of direction that codes can take, right? They can go to a place that is, hey, you get a box that is the biggest box you can fit on this piece of land, and that's it. That is something that can be done in codes. I actually haven't observed that myself, not even in places that we've often talked about zoning reform like Houston. They actually require a lot of things, but it is an option in this model code. There is another extreme end of the spectrum, which I'll kind of maybe call like the California approach, where everything is a series of trade-offs, right? Like maybe you provide a certain amount of affordable housing, but then you get reasonable standards for development, but otherwise you wouldn't really be able to develop anything, right? And there's risks on either side of this code, right? On the one end, if you have something that is a very, permissive baseline, you could certainly achieve a lot of production, but you're not going to achieve a lot of these other public policy objectives that we talked about, walkability, affordability, accessibility, et cetera. And also on the other end of the spectrum, if you get too restrictive with it, you are not going to see production that you need to see, right? Like, and then you're not going to achieve any of the public policy objectives because nothing happens, right? So I think I really want to emphasize, like, there are different approaches and a different place on the spectrum that different regulatory requirements can land on, and that there can be a tension between these two things when those goals don't necessarily always align, or they're trade-off between different public policy objectives. And I really want to hone in on this concept and the bonuses and flexibility. So we've talked a lot about the baseline, right? So like, the code provides a baseline for development. It takes, what is the kind of current status quo. It approaches it differently to say, hey, we want to actually allow more housing. We want to allow different ways of regulating intensity that incentivizes different layouts and construction of housing to achieve different outcomes. And we want to build into this code additional flexibility to achieve specific outcomes. So rather than this code mandating specific public policy outcomes, this code includes incentives, right? It says, hey, we have this permissive baseline, but if you want additional flexibility on certain parameters in this code, we are going to build that in exchange for public policy objectives objectively. Like there's no planning commission that you have to go to ask permission for this. These are things that are just granted. And basically you can divide them into two categories. There are bonuses. And basically what a bonus is a provision that lets you build more house in exchange for affordable or accessible housing. And this can take the form of FAR, it can take the form of bonus units, it can take the form of increased height, it can take the form of a lot of different standards that essentially get at building more building envelopes so you can provide more house in exchange for providing some degree of affordable housing or some degree of accessible housing that wouldn't otherwise be provided. And there's basically 5 categories of that. I'm not going to talk into the distinctions between all the 5 categories, but basically it's like there's different types of affordability that we care about, LIHTC versus maybe mixed income versus maybe affordable home ownership. And then of course there's accessibility. Obviously building code requires some baseline of accessibility, but in providing additional units that aren't otherwise required in the building code, either type B or type A units, there's also bonuses that can be derived there. These bonuses are stackable too, I'll add. In exchange for providing multiple public benefits, you can add additional more house on top of it, and it maxes out basically for LIHTC development projects, right? So we want to ensure that affordable housing can build as much housing as possible. But in addition to these bonuses, there's another category called flexibilities. And basically the distinction here is these aren't so much about building more house, but they're about giving more flexibility to development and design standards to remove things that could be potentially barriers to production or barriers to other public policy objectives. We've touched on some of these with the example of the pedestrian walkway. There's also examples in terms of like open space requirements, things like that. But basically, we built in these different flexibilities to encourage things like unit retention when you're building additional housing in an infill context, building small units, building kind of more units or providing size diversity, incorporating culturally sensitive design. There's different provisions in there that kind of enable culturally sensitive design. Access to different community amenities. We've talked about access to public parks, things like that. And of course, protection from harm, right? We don't want necessarily to orient to require orientation to a 4-lane high capacity arterial where people can be exposed to harm associated with traffic violence, right? And so there are different kind of provisions that are built into this code that achieve both allowing more housing on top of the baseline and giving more flexibility in exchange for these discrete public policy objectives. Now, that can be in tension, right? Because where you set that baseline for development and where you set those bonuses and flexibilities, they affect one another, right? Obviously, if you have too restrictive of a baseline, you don't achieve production, right? Even though your bonuses and flexibilities are very valuable. But if you go far in the other direction, the bonuses and flexibilities don't actually achieve any outcomes because the code's so permissive that there's no incentive to do anything, right? And this becomes very apparent when we go into the multi-unit bonus, particularly for accessible housing. So I want to start with some context here. This was a policy concept that was discussed in the original RAC process. Basically, the idea is we know modern building codes do not provide enough accessible housing, right? We know that, in terms of type B, its applicability is limited. And in terms of type A, its applicability is not only limited, but the actual number of units is very low. It's basically like 2% of dwellings that need to be type A when the requirement's triggered. Now, I know there was a bill that was introduced in the session, Senate Bill 444, that would have increased that. My understanding is that that bill has basically stalled and will not be passed into law. But I could be wrong about that. But one of the ideas that we incorporated in lieu of changes to the development code is why not integrate a bonus for the development of type A units that wouldn't otherwise be provided? Actually, that level is set exactly at the same amount that Senate Bill 444 is. It's basically 10% of units that are accessible via on the ground entrance or via an elevator. And it also aligns with the MUPD adoption ready action that had come across earlier. Now, there's a question about how do you make that bonus valuable, right? And one of the things that we explored is, well, okay, well, what different building code requirements trigger? We talked about how multi-unit development becomes more and more expensive, essentially the higher that you go, right? So much so that we're not trying to optimize for things that aren't wood frame development. Like we don't care about tower development because it doesn't pencil basically in any market. But once you kind of get to the bottom level, so like basically 3 stories, what we learned, we reached out to our building code colleagues. This is a simplification of what we learned from that. Is basically 3 stories is about the cheapest you can possibly build a multi-family apartment or a multi-unit apartments. Basically, when you build to 3 stories, you can use framing methods that are basically identical to detached single unit dwellings, right? It's not particularly difficult to do in terms of the framing requirements. There's no fire resistance ratings, anything like that, no requirements for elevators, et cetera, et cetera. Once you add an additional floor, you start triggering some additional requirements. They're not very significant. They're fire resistant ratings, right? So they are maybe a little bit more complex, a little bit more expensive, but they're definitely doable. You haven't triggered a lot of requirements yet. At 5 stories, that's when you start triggering requirements. You can still be wood framed at 5 stories, but you are required to provide sprinklers. You're required to provide elevators. All of these things are pretty expensive. They require specialized labor to provide, and they make it much more expensive to build. And then, of course, once you hit 6 or 7 stories, you basically move into required podium construction. You have to have a concrete podium in order to build that high. Again, there's different methodologies. I don't want to say that these are all the same for all of these different floors, but the general idea is that as you start to build higher, the construction methods you have to use start to differ, and that actually makes the distinction between the baseline and the bonuses very important. And Shannon, I see you have your hand up. Would you mind saving this until we get into discussion? It'll be over pretty soon. Now, in the current scheme, right, the baseline that is provided in the model code is, hey, no worries about any bonuses or flexibilities or anything like that. You can build 3-story apartment building anywhere. You have the ability. We talked about the different formats that you can provide that in. It's just allowed by right? And that's, a baseline that we could establish that at. And we provide a bonus basically for an additional 3 stories in exchange for different public policy objectives. They're stackable, right? So if you provide type A accessible units, you can get an additional floor. If you build a LIHTC unit, you can get all 3 floors, or LIHTC units, my apologies. But basically the idea here is to build in these incentives, especially for accessible housing that wouldn't otherwise be required in any development context, right? So the idea here is building type A units that wouldn't otherwise be provided, especially, but there's also affordability incentives. Now, here's the thing. That 4th story is extremely valuable because once you hit that 5th story, you trigger different requirements for things like elevators and sprinklering. It becomes much less enticing to build a 5th story. It becomes much less valuable bonus to build a 5th story because it becomes much more expensive to do that. It's not as feasible in most market types, though it can be, and depending on the context, depending on the cost of land, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we don't want to prevent, especially affordable housing developers, from having that option available to them, right? So that's why it goes up to 6 stories. The question is, it could go up to 7 stories. I don't know. But there's a question of where do we set that baseline? If we set the baseline at 4 stories, there's not much incentive to provide type A units that wouldn't otherwise be provided except as required in the building code, because you would trigger a requirement for an elevator, you trigger sprinkling requirements. And as a consequence, if we set that baseline above 4 stories or above 4 stories, we basically can expect that the bonus won't be very effective at achieving accessible units that wouldn't otherwise be required. So that's a tension. Where do we set that? How do we talk about that issue where there's this tension between these 2 public policy objectives that have been stated as priorities by this work group, right? And that's a kind of conversation that I want to get into. There's plenty of examples of this tension happening at different points in the code. We actually talk about a lot of them in the specific questions that we provided in the pamphlet. I really wanted to focus on this one though, because it's one very clear example of this tension occurring. And also, I think it's a very important one because we've talked a lot and really emphasized the provision of accessible housing. And this is basically one of our only tools to do it. So I wanted to talk about that. Shannon, I see you had a question. But maybe we kind of get into some of the discussion questions too. Basically, the idea here is how do we make this balance between right? The idea of facilitating production, which we do want to have a code that is more permissive than the status quo. That is absolutely something we're going to be ingratiating into this. But how do we balance this with the other public policy objectives that this work group has stated were priorities, right? And especially in the context of accessible housing, where we don't really have any other tools because those policies have been not passed, right? So Shannon, I see you had your hand up first, so I wanted to provide that there. But yeah, Deb, I'll let you facilitate from here.
Thanks, Sean. Go
Yeah.
ahead, Shannon.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Deb. I guess I'm just feeling a little tender on this particular topic, given some media that has recently happened in the Portland metro region pertaining to 3-story wood-framed buildings. So I'm conceptually seeing that no sprinklers are required for a 3-story building, but that has been the hotly contested media city ombudsman piece that the local habitat affiliate has gone through, in part because the developed homes have nice tall ceilings. So it's really unclear to me if cities are already mandating sprinklers with a height, restriction for 3 stories. I don't understand. I guess I'm just not understanding this overlay. It's also, it's actually an issue, right? When we talk about denser development, and there's so much I don't know because my background is not in planning, is that, do we need to tie in larger access ways if we're going 3 stories or higher? And then does that end up reducing our FAR coverage? I just, I'm concerned about pragmatic implementation against that backdrop.
And if I can add, I'm obviously not a building code specialist. This was my very simplification. And I think there's other ways of building buildings. There's different triggers for different requirements. I'm not saying that this is exactly where you would find type 5B is applicable for all 3-story wood framed apartments. But it is something, I basically reached out to Tony Rocco at BCD to kind of ask hey, we're trying to understand where different requirements kick in at different kind of heights. And this was a summary of that response that came back to me. It could be kind of hard for me to understand because there's a lot of acronyms and jargon that are not part of my professional lexicon. So I want to throw that caveat in there. I'm not saying that sprinklers are not required at 3-story apartments, but what I am saying is that generally what we took away from this is the higher you go, the more expensive it gets because the more requirements trigger, right?
Thank you. Understand the concerns and confusions as well. Thank you, Shannon. Brock, I'm going to go to Kathy first since we haven't heard from her yet today, and then I'll come to you. Thank you. Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, in the discussion about these accessibility, there's a statement that there are some multifamily dwellings that are not required to comply with the Fair Housing Act, and that puzzles me. I can't imagine a multi-story dwelling.
Oh, Kathy, if I can clarify, so there are kind of different requirements that trigger at different thresholds in the Fair Housing Act. So one is what's called a covered multifamily dwelling. This is basically any apartment style construction of 4 units or more. When that happens, any unit that is on the ground floor or accessible by an elevator has to be type B, that's adaptable, right? Yep. And then at 20 units, there is another requirement that triggers where I believe it's 2% of units need to be type A, which is a higher level of adaptability. Sometimes they're called accessible in different areas of legislation, but basically a higher level of accessibility than is what otherwise provided. What Senate Bill 444 did is it reduced the thresholds for each of these, I believe, to 3 units and 15 units for type A units. And for type A units, it increased that number that would be provided to 10%. And basically the approach here is to say, well, hey, that law doesn't appear to be passing. It's been referred to rules. And if we went with the status quo, we would see only in projects of 20 or more units, 2% of units would be built to a type A standard. We know that's not enough. We understand from a data perspective that's not enough to meet the need. Even if every single unit developed between now and Kingdom Come was a 20-unit covered multifamily dwelling, it wouldn't be enough units. So there's a question of, well, we can't require that because building code preempts local requirements, but we can establish incentives. If you decide that you want to build 10% type A units, in addition, you get just a bonus floor, right? You can build more housing units to kind of offset the costs that are associated with that. That's the tension.
Does that answer your question, Kathy?
Yeah, I just think it's poorly worded in the discussion, because it talks about multifamily dwellings that are not required to comply.
These are type A and type B units that aren't otherwise required by the building code. So it's bonus type
Right.
A and type B units. Yeah.
Right.
I think Kathy is getting that. I think she's suggesting that the wording makes it seem like Fair Housing Act doesn't apply to writ large. Fair Housing Act doesn't apply, not specific to the type of unit, which Fair Housing Act absolutely applies to housing.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, okay. Thank you, Kathy, for raising that. Brock.
Yeah. One, I think striking a good balance with the 3-floor bonus up to 6. And then I'll just throw a second onto Shannon's comment, just broadly. And then, so the one question that I have, so page 81, when we're looking at calculating density, we have fractions of units are rounded down, and I totally understand the intent there. What I think I'd like to see here is something more like a de minimis standard of like half a unit per acre or something like that. Or maybe saying like you can round in either direction, but you have to round towards the one that makes the project more feasible. So like say you have, right, going through all the ones that are listed, right? Single family would be 8, middle housing is 16, multi-unit housing is a minimum of 20. Let's say you have, a quadplex, right, on a lot, and the way that the project would pencil out brings it to like 15.8. I think they should be able to round up. Obviously, if you're calculating density and there's like a maximum, and so say you're building apartments, right? And the maximum is say 25 an acre, and you end up with 25.4 or something like that. Then I see that rounding down being beneficial, but I think it can play both ways. And so I think some flexibility there would probably be good, just for those. And I know that only applies to the new lots, right? And that's probably easier to manage if you're doing subdivisions and things like that, where you can kind of plan out a broader sort of community. But just a consideration of maybe adopting a de minimis standard or some kind of like flexibility in the way that you can round those numbers, as long as it makes the project more feasible.
Kathy, thoughts on that?
Yeah. Again, just a quick clarification, that calculation specifically for calculating minimum density. So the reason it rounds down is because the lower your minimum density, the more flexibility the developer has. So we could say, well, it rounds up in some cases, but in fact, that narrows the flexibility for the development site. So it's by rounding down, it's simply saying it's less restrictive. And that was because it's min density as opposed to maximum. And it's not intended to apply to those lots, that whole lot size question. So I think that section is, or that measurement methodology is specifically referred to as applying to the minimum density calculation, not the min lot size. So we can try and clarify that further. I know it's odd to just have minimum density and no maximum density. So,
yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let's just assume that there is no maximum density in that case, but still, if you're saying like, okay, we can develop this into, a quadplex, but in relation to everything else, when you have your net acreage and you factor in all your, setbacks and different things like that, it comes out to 15.8 instead of rounding to the nearest whole number, which would then meet the minimum density requirement. It would round down to 15, which then wouldn't, and the project wouldn't be able to go forward. That's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah. So, it is, I see your point. Yeah. Okay. We can clarify that. I think we were thinking of it in terms of how you calculate the applicability. So if you were to round down, your requirement is 15 units. So clearly if you're at 15.8, you comply. If you are at 16, you comply. If you round up and you're at 15.8 and you round up, the requirement is 16, and therefore you don't comply. So we want to make sure that we leave as wide opportunity as possible with min density to not have that standard overly limit the development on the site, but still set I think the goal was to then still set so folks didn't underbuild, right? But I see what you're saying about the wording. That's a very good point.
Because I totally understand the intent of having the min density.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And things like that. Just trying to make sure that, in those cases where it might become a, de minimis issue, that can be addressed.
Area for clarification. Great. Thank you. I'm going to keep us moving. Kathy, I'm going to go to Mac since we haven't heard from Mac yet, and then I'll come back to you, but go ahead, Mac.
Yes, thank you. So admittedly, I've been having some work done on my house here and haven't been as present today as I would wish, but I did want to comment on some of the things that I've noticed in the code that I was actually very happy about and appreciative to staff for hearing it. One of those items is the the bedroom density option for affordable housing. I was really, really excited to hear that. I'm glad no one was home. I screamed out of giddy when I saw it. So I just want to be thankful for that. Again, I think that provides a lot of flexibility for affordable developers to really right size a lot in a location based off the unit mix that's necessary and the population needs to make more family sized affordable housing pencil in more locations. One of the other elements in the code that I actually also really liked is the parking maximums, actually, to prevent sort of outrageous parking requirements. I've seen some jurisdictions for studio unit almost like basically require 2. I know this is a minimum, but it's still required 2 units per studio, which is kind of absurd. And so even like capping that out to make sure that we're actually building housing and not just parking lots is really great. I've had to joke too often that I build parking with housing as an amenity on the side. And so I think that this is a right size direction and showing where our priorities should be and just the like there. So thank you.
Thank you, Mac. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Mac. Yeah, and if I could just chime in just a little bit on the parking, just so folks understand some of the intent there. So we've talked about parking, right? Large city model code does not require any parking for any housing type. There are some like smaller parking requirements as you get into the medium and the smaller cities, but they're much less than what is generally provided. You're not going to see anything above 1 space per unit. There's also exemptions for affordable housing, for small unit sizes, things like that. And really the intent of the maximum parking is just around like, how much do we need to optimize for 3-car garages, right? Like, is that something we want to see? Do we want to see these really large parking lots? And we also tried to balance that with, sometimes that addition of the amenity can increase the financial feasibility. So we also want to make sure that, if folks decide that they want to provide some parking, that there's a reasonable amount that they can provide.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Kathy, please.
One of the problems I've had with our discussion and with the things we're considering is that we are not explicitly calling out how these can be used. Not just to provide more housing, but to provide housing for specific groups. So, for example, the minimum density exception, that would be used for culturally specific housing and multi-bedroom units, which are both needed. And I think we should mention how they can be used. Also, at the beginning of everything, before we start the meeting, we talk about the racial equity framework, and there's nothing in any of this that talks about what is most helpful to address the equities.
Yeah, can I speak to that a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah, so when you're dealing with development codes, a lot of everything that you're grappling with in terms of racial and economic segregation, as well as like outcomes, is all implicit, right? So like, I'm sure you're familiar with Buchanan v. Worley, right? Like we used to have explicitly racial zoning laws, right, that were declared unconstitutional. The pivot from that point was to move to zoning codes that were race neutral in their face, but had effects that subtly created disproportionate impacts between groups, right? And so we are still in that legal paradigm and context today. And a lot of the considerations around how we develop, create development codes is, well, how do we address a lot of these historic disparities in that way, that same way that kind of happened with the racial zoning kind of covenants, right? So like we want to make sure that we are establishing things like, for example, a good example of what we thought about this is we have these pedestrian orientation standards adjacent to transit streets, right? So if you're adjacent to a transit street, the idea is that you have an entrance to that. But one of the explicit considerations was, well, wait a minute, a lot of people build multi-unit housing adjacent to high-speed arterials, right, where there are cars. And that creates an EJ concern, right? Because you have significant noise, you have significant brake dust, you have significant pollution, exposure to traffic violence, and there might be a bus line on there, sure. But is that something that you want to expose folks in a development to that environmental harm? So one of the things that we did is we thought, okay, well, let's establish this provision that essentially provides an exemption to that to avoid that harm and to provide some buffering between that person and the arterial to ensure that they're protected from harm, right? That's an example of an implicit piece in the code that is trying to get at specifically like racial and economic segregation patterns and these harms that are inflicted by most modern zoning codes kind of implicitly, or maybe even sometimes without realizing it. And this happens all over the place. This happens in terms of accessibility and like how our design standards intersect with them. This happens in terms of like, trying to ensure that we have integrated neighborhoods and by not restricting any lot that exists from having a particular unit on it, right? Like these show up everywhere, but they're all implicit, right? Because that is the framework. And this is part of the historical inequities conversation that we're having. That is part of our legal context, right? That is part of the structure of white supremacist zoning in the United States, right? So that's something I wanted to raise as a thing. So that's why you're seeing that. A lot of those considerations, they're things that we actively thought about. But you wouldn't see that just by reading the standard, right? Because it cannot be explicitly about a protected class, right? So that's the hard part.
Yeah, the problem is that I'm not sure cities are going to think creatively enough to know which are the tools they can use to address racial inequity or can solve their problem with culturally specific or multiple bedrooms.
Kathy, can we put a pin in that until we get to our goal 10 discussion?
Sure.
Because I would like to talk about that particular. How do we translate this to the implementation at the local government level? Yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds like we'll talk about it next, but it might be a solution and guidance or some other ways that DLCD can help support cities in making these choices. Couple of hands up. I do want to encourage those of you we haven't heard from yet. I know many of you regulate using bonuses and or have tried to make developments work using bonuses for various public policies. It'd be really great to hear your experiences with those and where maybe the draft code is moving in a direction that's helpful or that you've seen sort of play out really well and areas or pitfalls to think about some more. So with that, Matt, please go ahead.
Well, first of all, I love the bonuses section of the model code that I'm looking at. I think the categories 2A, 2B, splitting that up into those two categories was really, really smart. My question that I'm having is, when I look at it, for certain bonuses, let's say for like townhouses in medium cities, I'm curious about the size of the bonus and how you like got to that size of bonus for category 2A versus 1C or 1A or 1B, or at least maybe that's an area where more thinking or more research or calibration, I guess, I don't know, needs to happen. Because I can see like in certain tables where, essentially there's kind of like equating the importance of type A units in terms of the bonus size to the policy objective of, let's say, category 1A or 1B. Like we're basically sort of weighing these two policy objectives about the same because we're giving about the same bonus. I'm not sure if I'm reading that right. So I just wondering if you could say a little bit more.
Yeah. So this is one of those areas where, so when developing these bonuses, we had to say like, well, what existing areas of law are there, right, around different bonuses that are provided? I mean, we have them for some, we don't have them for others. One of the things that was kind of clear is like, okay, so when 2138 is in development, we're like, well, there's this law, it might become law. it has these different provisions around requirements for different things. One of them is this bonus. It's basically you get bonus units in exchange for affordable homeownership options or providing a type A unit where it's otherwise not provided. And it's not yet a requirement. We don't know if it's going to become law. I mean, I think the legislative session is starting to end, and I think it's proceeding. But we thought that hey, well, there's nothing that prevents us from doing this, right? We should have a bonus structure. This is something that we're going to need to align with anyway. So let's take this concept, let's iterate on it a little bit. I think we included some additional provisions for mixed income, affordable housing, for the inclusion of type B units where they're not otherwise provided, and align with essentially the bonus units that are provided in House Bill 2138. So that's where the calibration has not happened yet. One additional consideration for townhouses specifically. So it does align with the Plex bonus, which is basically one bonus unit for every, or is it 2 bonus units for every 4 units? So a total of 6 units, but one of them has to be an accessible or an affordable homeownership opportunity. That's the amount that's specified in 2138.
Okay.
So that's where that's set currently. It could be calibrated to something different, but we do need to align broadly with 2138 if it passes.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I'll note is we also wanted to, in particular for townhouses, there's a new typology of townhouse that was recently allowed by the building codes, which is called an attached stacked 2-family dwelling. And basically what it lets you build are different, basically a townhouse with 2 units instead of 1. And they're attached to other townhouses. And so we also incorporated, you could have these either all horizontal with one another, or they can be vertically divided as well. So we tried to enable those 2 different configurations because it's now legal under the building code. So it's very similar to the affordable 6-plex concept that's in Portland, but incorporates the requirements in 2138 that are going to be requirements basically once they are implemented. Yeah, so that was a very long technical explanation. We thought a lot about this townhouse bonus.
Yeah. And it wasn't necessarily specific to the townhouse bonus. I guess just generally speaking, thinking about, I'm wondering how you dialed in the size of the bonuses for each particular bonus.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So
and size of city.
For all the middle housing ones, it's 2138. For the multi-unit, it's loosely based on 197A 445, which is the kind of by right affordable housing bonus. But that one regulates by density, so we had to kind of structure a little bit differently to give bonuses for FAR. And then for detached single units, for ADUs, and I believe that's it, there aren't existing statutory bonuses, so we had to develop those de novo. And those are for detached single units, it's primarily like a lot size and development intensity bonus that you get for different things. And then for ADUs, it is like bonus units.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question, Matt. Michael.
I first of all think that this is mostly terrific, echoing Mac's sentiment. I think especially the multifamily zoning portion of it is a huge opportunity for the state to really define what a pretty, liberal, simple apartment zone would allow. And the more that we can spread this, I totally agree with your repeated point, Sean, that this is a lot more usable than what a lot of cities have in a lot of their multifamily zones today. And conceptually, to the question about the 3 stories by right-ish and 4 stories with bonus, great. I love that concept. I agree that that's a good way to use that 4th story. I wonder if it's actually achieved by these ratios that are proposed here, like the 1-to-1 FAR on a Medford downtown lot, I think is 60,000 square feet. So that's in the highest category. If you can build exactly 1 story across that entire lot, and then with bonuses, you can build up to 2 stories. But if I subdivide that, then I can build up to 4 stories. I didn't understand how how this translates into that 3+1 concept you're describing.
This is going to be one of those where we have to do some tweaking and calibrating on where should the baseline FARs be set, and then where should the bonus FARs be set. the idea, the big thing that we tried to optimize for was this idea of, well, in the urban infill lots, so like these lots that are generally, I think they're like less than 10,000 is the amount. The building can consume most of the lot. It's like a FAR ratio of 3 to 1. So if you built a 3-story building, that would consume basically all of the lot, right? And there's some requirements around like, setbacks and stuff that might restrict that a little bit, but FAR is not going to be the limitation. And basically the idea behind the bonus is just give bonus floor, right? That's the idea. And so there's going to need to be some calibration, like how does this work on larger sites versus how does this work on smaller sites? We want to make sure that the bonus achieves that objective of like, you get bonus floor, But yeah, that is a point. We thought about that, and that's kind of the intent behind the bonus provision. I don't know, Kathy, Kate, if you want to speak to that more.
I think that covers it really well. Again, I think this is the area of calibration that really, the bonuses, we did our best to sort of get something on paper to get the conversation started, but it is a starting place for the conversation. So looking for that feedback. It's good to hear like the remark on a downtown lot in Medford's going to be larger, more almost akin to a greenfield in some other communities, right, at that size. So, again, there's a lot of room to calibrate all of these. And I think that's where we are, is like just wanted to get it down on paper so you could see how the system might work. And then we could take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like,
yeah, that's great.
It seemed like a steep downward slope as you get up in the lot sizes based on those FAR things. And like if some of that is written with the assumption that some of it is going to be surface parking, that's fine, but I don't want it to be a parking mandate by a different name, So like allowing the FAR flexibility seems useful. On the bonuses, the affordability bonus, 20% at 80 AMI for 10 years. I wondered if that's really worth the trouble, right? Like, isn't in a multifamily dwelling, aren't most homes going to come in pretty close to 80% AMI in many cases anyway? I wondered in the context of Portland, so the inclusionary zoning program is calibrated to prioritize 10% at 60%, and so none of those buildings would qualify unless they were also at 80% for another 10%. Obviously you can't anticipate all the different things, but
yeah.
I just wondered if it seemed like it wasn't even achieving that much for affordability, and so I wondered about that.
I think this is a great question for Becky. This is like, we have these two categories that we knew were going to be there. One is like the 30-year LIHTC. One is the affordability bonus in 2138. But is there something that can gap that bridge in between? Becky, feel free to speak to that a little bit more.
This is, and Michael, you're absolutely right. There's going to be some situations where, yeah, like 100% of the units are affordable at under 80% of AMI, and others where that's not achievable at all. The reason for the specific provisions that are in there, it's just kind of latching onto the what's in state law for inclusionary. That is the requirement you can require under the states. So it's written to create a sort of opt-in inclusionary bonus. And that's why that is there. I think there's no harm in saying or 10% at 60. I don't see a downside of that, but the reason it is the way it is just because it is not possible in any way to calibrate an effective mixed income density bonus at a statewide level to last over many years. We anchored it on a thing that exists in state law, but I don't see any harm in saying you can do this or the 10% at 60, and then at least it would pick up that option that exists in Portland's program and sort of mirror. Again, it would be a voluntary version of Portland's set-asides. And I think that's reasonable. I think if you're in a situation where many of the units are going to be affordable at 80% of AMI or below anyway, the question is really, are you willing to put an obligation on the property to guarantee that. There's going to be situations where that's not really worth it for the developer, and it's not really worth it for the tenant to like go through income verification to get basically the same rent they would get anyway.
Exactly. Right.
In which case, hopefully they just, you know, it's like if it really matters to them to get that bonus, then okay.
Yeah.
But I think because it's voluntary, I'm less concerned that it has to work in every context. I think if you have a context where it's not really getting you below market rents, you're not going to jump through the hoop to get the bonus, probably, if there's enough of an entitlement there for you as it is.
Well, if I can add to Becky, because one of the things that I thought was kind of a little bit clever about this threshold was it pairs with property tax exemption programs that exist in state law. So it's a useful option for pairing. Like if you have, say, like a MUPD, this can be a useful bonus that pairs with that, which I thought was a useful, like a good kind of synergy with some of the other adoption ready actions that I know folks are considering. I don't know, Becky, if you agree with that, but I thought it was a good idea. And maybe the takeaway is like more options than just that 80%. I think that's also reasonable, because we were thinking about like, yeah, what are the reasonable options here that are between these two kind of options?
Yeah. Okay. On the accessibility bonus. But just to quickly respond, Becky, yeah, I agree that like if it's not worth the trouble, then the developer and the tenant may not be interested. But like if we're structuring this whole thing around the assumption they are going to effectively get that greater FAR, because if we want them to actually build a 4-story building and they're not going to build a 4-story building because of this, then that would be dumb. We should just allow them higher the larger building and let the city do a IZ program if it wants to.
And I think a calibration question, especially, I think in particular, this is going to be particularly important for the type A units. I think one of the things that I've learned from analyzing the literature is like nobody really knows how much a type A unit actually costs in terms of like the development impacts it has. And, you know, like upstream and downstream in terms of like the saleability of the unit. So that makes it very hard to calibrate, like, how do we make sure that this bonus is effective, but also still allows 4-story market rate apartments? You know what I mean?
Right.
And that's going to be part of this effort. Like, we want to make sure we're doing that kind of study to understand and characterize what those costs are.
Yeah. Okay. So to the accessibility point, it's 10% of the first floor unless there's an elevator, in which it's 10% of the entire building. That seems like it could risk a perverse incentive to avoid the elevator. It also seems like if it's only 10% of you imagine a tuck under building, there would be very few units on the first floor. I wondered about that. Also, like, my understanding is that usually architects will want to build the same design on top of each other. So if there's a large, accessible bathroom on this unit in this corner, then the one above it is also going to have the same, and the next and the same. But if there's no elevator, then that's not useful. So there's some inefficiencies there potentially.
Yeah, we were kind of going back and forth. Like, should it be a flat percentage? Should it be based, or should it align with basically the building code, right? Which is has that perverse incentive for better or for worse, right? And that's not a clear question for us, but we thought that a good starting place for this discussion would be, well, these are the same as what would be required under Senate Bill 444, as well as this kind of other MUPD provision that was developed in the ARA.
Yeah, just raising the issue. And 2 quick notes on the regulatory parking maximum. I'm not convinced that that's worth it. Like, you got the edge cases where maybe I want to build a bigger parking lot for the building across the street that has a low parking ratio or whatever. It just seems like you're not achieving very much by setting a regulatory maximum in the zoning code, though obviously I'm for lower minimums.
Yeah, there's kind of like, there's an incentive to provide parking, like, anyways, depending on the context of the project. And of course, if you're building multi-unit, like, it's probably because you want, like, land is, you want to make more efficient use of land, right? So that is a question, like, is it self-regulating? I think what we sought to do was to say, like, okay, well, what would be a reasonable set that kind of gets at and aligns broadly with the climate-friendly and equitable communities model codes, but also deviates from them slightly to say, like, well, we're not trying to just optimize for CFAs, we're trying to optimize for broader areas, right? So we have more kind of permissive parking maximums. So that way, if there's kind of an incentive to provide parking along with a unit, that it's not kind of like unduly restricted by the code. Again, I think it's like, is that necessary? Is it not? I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a priority, and even if it is within scope.
But it is a deviation from our other model codes, right? Like that's kind of the trade-off that we have to consider.
Which
Like we
was-
also heard this.
That was a
this-
climate
yeah.
context code. This is a housing production code.
For sure. Yeah, that's the tension that, yeah. But no, it's a good point.
Detachable plexes. I didn't understand. Maybe this is going to change with 2138, but this right now it's structured as part of the incentive is that you get to build detached homes. I'm not convinced that that's a very powerful incentive because it's so easy to like do a fake detached home that's technically attached. So like it seems to me it's so much easier, as most cities in Oregon have done, to say the first 4 can be attached or detached in any combination.
So there's actually there's a disincentive because the model code, this is a dynamic that I'm unfamiliar with because I have to review these as part of my job as a housing accountability and production officer person. So there is a perverse incentive that was created by an unintentional confluence between detached plexes and the Middle Housing Land Division. Basically, it created an incentive for people who are developing basically what are detached single units to call them nominally a quadplex and undergo the Middle Housing, essentially bypass local subdivision regulations. That I've actually watched this occur in a different context, basically to build 4 detached single units on half-acre lots that were very large. They're not a quadplex in any configuration other than as a technicality, to bypass local partition subdivision regulations. So that was something that we took and thought, okay, well, this is unexpected. We didn't expect this in the context of the model code. Let's take this back. Let's think about what we are trying to use detached plexes to facilitate small units, to facilitate additions to existing units, to facilitate, some configuration flexibility if you're building, say, a type B unit that wouldn't otherwise be required, those types of things. To get at those different provisions. We'll need to update this with 2138 coming out, but that was the intent.
I think most people like detached homes, and there's no use trying to force them to have attached ones, I guess. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Michael. I am sorry, but I need to do a time check. We're running a little long. I want to make sure we give at least some time to our final discussion, but I see a lot of interest in this one. So I'm going to propose we go to 11:30. I'm also going to point out that detailed comments and other kinds of comments we warmly welcome by email and writing, or I'm sure you could call Sean if you just want to talk things through as well.
Don't promise too much. No.
So I'll leave that comment there. Let's go to 11. I don't know what I just said, but let's go to 11:30. So another 8 minutes, and see how far we get. And then I'm just going to apologize in advance if I have to cut this conversation short. So Garland, please welcome to the meeting.
Thank you. I just have, I guess I have a bunch of comments and questions. And so the first one is why ADUs and multi-dwelling unit sizes would be capped at 1,000 square feet. In our work, we routinely recommend increasing a maximum size to 1,200 square feet to allow for larger family sizes. And so I don't really understand why we would keep this at 1,000 square feet. When you go up to 1,200 square feet, you allow for like 3-bedroom units, which are in large demand for larger family sizes.
Yeah, so if I could speak to this, so there was this kind of tension, like where does an ADU? So there's a lot of overlap between these different standards of like what is a detached flex versus an ADU, that type of thing. And one of the things that we were thinking about in the context of this ADU code, and I should mention, multi-unit do not have a cap at 1,000. That's a misunderstanding of the code.
Well, it's for the parking exemption.
Right, it's just a parking exemption. Large cities don't require any parking. This is for small cities. So it's just
small
saying,
cities are small cities have
yeah, but small cities
worse-
won't use the code if they don't like it, right? It's a waste of time and resources to develop a code nobody uses.
Right, but small cities have worse feasibility problems than large cities. So you want to actually do more to make development feasible in small cities because their rents don't go up as high as in large cities, but the hard costs are the same. And so they need
Garland,
more help.
I can produce a code nobody uses, right? Or I can follow the statutory direction that we have to produce a code for small cities that balances and considers their objectives as well, right? that as directed to by Senate Bill 1564.
So you're saying that small cities don't want development and don't want development to pistols. That's something that only large cities want.
No, but small cities are very hesitant to reduce their parking requirements. That is fundamentally true basically in every small city I've talked to, except for a very small handful.
Well, then I think someone needs to get out there in the bully pulpit and tell small cities the reason you're not seeing development is because you're requiring parking.
And
if you want to see more homes built in your city, get off your high horse, get over it. You need to deal with the parking situation like responsible adults. And that means dealing with it in the public realm or off-site, but not requiring developers to do it.
I feel your passion, Garland. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I do. I have some more comments. The second is related. Why require parking anywhere in the state? Parking always reduces the feasibility of development. Development often pencils worse in rural areas and small towns. Why do we make it more difficult to pencil by allowing parking to be required anywhere? So that's the second comment.
Right.
Third is, why are we regulating FAR to put our finger on the scale in favor of more units rather than larger units? We also need family-sized homes. We should not regulate FAR for buildings under 10 stories. Instead, we should just regulate height and lot coverage.
We had some, I think you came in a little bit late today, Garland. We had some conversation about that early on in the calibration, so that might be good.
I would recommend not regulating FAR. It's over-regulation. You can get all the regulation you need on wood frame buildings with just height and lot coverage. You don't need to regulate FAR. It's an over-regulation.
All right.
It's like
Anything
putting
else?
a stop sign at a traffic light. The next thing is design standards. The model code should be compatible with design standards. If local communities want to regulate to produce beautiful, lovable development, this should not be a barrier to achieving those goals. And so I would just want to make sure that there's plenty of hooks in the model code to allow for local communities to adopt design standards so they can regulate beauty. To me, it's a warning that this code says it doesn't regulate design, because that means that it's going to allow ugly buildings that people don't love. And I think that it's really, really important that we be concerned with the aesthetics of our communities, and that we, as we seek to densify our communities and make the level of development more intense, we're also coding for beautiful outcomes in places that people can love. If we go through this whole process and we solve the crisis, the housing crisis, but the net result is an ugly hellscape, I don't think we will have won. And so we need to allow for the regulation of beauty by our local communities as well. And finally, why are the minimum lot sizes so high for townhomes? The row home model that produced $55,000 townhomes in Montreal in the 1990s featured lot sizes as small as 525 square feet. Are we intentionally driving up the cost of housing by requiring lots to be overly large, even after all the bonuses have hit the ground? Those are my comments for now.
Okay, thank you. I think you've highlighted some other areas maybe that are worth thinking about as calibration and additional research. Thank you for that, Garland. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I want to harken back to Michael's comments and kind of plus one that note about building in stacks, particularly in affordable housing. Our default design is always going to be in stacks to realize those cost efficiencies there. Walsh Construction has put out a document that is sort of like best practices in efficient building design to be most efficient with those hard costs and bring down the cost of housing there. And so whenever you do have a deviation from the ground floor unit plan versus the stacks above it, it does add sort of cost to the project there. And I know it comes in tension with accessibility as well in the ground floor, but I just wanted to call that out there, particularly from an affordable perspective and trying to control costs. Thanks.
Thank you. Matt.
So I just wanted to add a little bit onto the qualifying category for type A units for multi-unit housing. I'm curious, I think it was probably intentional, the wording, in terms of that for every floor with an elevator. But I did want to flag that typically that sort of language about any upper floor served by an elevator is used with respect to the type B unit requirement, saying that, you're only required to have type B units and a floor served by an elevator. And, if we're trying to align it with SB 444s, they're very different because that was a regulatory building code requirement. This is an incentive. But if we're trying to align them, SB 444's language was basically 10% of the units. It wasn't 10% per floor if it was served by an elevator. I think if you just made it 10% of the units, it would remove that disincentive or perverse incentive not to install an elevator. But I'm curious, if you have more to say about like why that was specifically included, I'd be happy to talk about it offline, or if you want to now, that'd be great.
Becky, do you have some quick add, or Sean? Sorry.
I could just say very quickly that the reason it's structured that way is because of the issue that was raised earlier, that didn't want to set too high of a number that might not be achievable with the units that are on an accessible path, either ground floor or elevator. So it's basically trying to get substitution of type A for where you already could do type B, because if you can't do type B, you can't do type A. I think that's the sort of theory here is saying, if you're upstairs or you're not on an accessible path in the first place, then it's not a good place to put a type A unit. If you move that percentage up from 2% to a number that's too high, in some cases, a development there might not be 10% or 15 or 20% of units that are on an accessible path in the first place. And so that's why it's kind of linked to the type B language. But happy to have further conversation about that offline. I think it's an important detail, and I think your comments are well taken.
Thank you for raising that, and thank you all. Let's move on to the final discussion. We'll go to about 10 till, so 20 minutes. And Sean, I think this is a shorter setup, so hopefully we can.
Yeah, this is a definitely shorter setup. So this one is on the integration of the broader kind of model code with adoption ready actions and the Goal 10 implementation framework. So I think we've talked, the work group has had conversations about different types of adoption ready actions before that hadn't been so focused on kind of land use regulation, but more focused on kind of other different types of actions that aren't quite land use regulations, things like property tax exemptions, et cetera, et cetera. But the model code has this broader role in Goal 10 implementation that is statutory and also related to this work group conversation, especially in the relationship to adoption ready actions that cities can take to, facilitate housing production, affordability, and choice. So let me share my screen really quick. So just a reminder on the kind of statutory direction that we have for model codes. Model codes have to be used this way under statute, is that they have this role as guidance and promising practice. It's most relevant and when we're talking about Goal 10, about providing resources for local governments to facilitate production, affordability, and choice. The second one is around this optional kind of adoption and application by reference. We talked about this particularly being a tool for small cities to allow different housing types that they might not otherwise be able to, given restraints on their code and inability to update those codes. And then, of course, it has this regulatory and compliance function. We talked about this in the context of the LCDC enforcement order. It also has this HAPO function as we develop different modules for the enforcement and implementation of different housing laws. So one thing I wanted to kind of note here, there were various kind of land use related adoption ready actions that were proposed that this code can provide a comparative benchmark for action, right? So if you're a large city, city above 25,000 doing Goal 10 work, and you're considering different land use actions that you can take, something that this model code can serve is to inform adoption ready actions that give something off the shelf that a city can do to achieve or facilitate production, affordability, and choice. One of those obviously is parking reductions. We know many cities have been doing this, but the model code doesn't require parking for large cities, so that could be a benchmark that they can compare it to. We've talked about code and process streamlining. Everything in the model code is ministerially reviewed via, I believe it's a 60-day timeline. There are, again, we've talked about some of the refinements to the development and design standards. We still have more refinement to go, but once those are finalized, they can be kind of a reference, a benchmark to say, hey, this is a good way of regulating development. There are obviously built in these bonus incentives that we've talked about. And of course, generally, just if you're allowing more housing choice in zones, these can provide a benchmark. Like if you want to allow townhouses, what code provisions should you have in there to ensure that townhouses are feasible? The model code can serve a good benchmark for that. I also want to highlight just some limitations in the code. I think we've talked about this a lot. The code is not the only method of regulating development, or even necessarily the best method of regulating development. It's balancing its objectives that are required under Senate Bill 1564, as well as applicability across the state. Again, there's going to need to be more refinement that happens there, but it's not prescriptive, right? Like we've talked about other ways of regulating intensity and form of development, or even potentially cities that choose to still regulate development. they can still achieve similar outcomes that are in the model code. They just have to do it a different way, right? And so what the code can provide is a benchmark for that, right? It can provide a, hey, this is an outcome, this is an intensity that is reasonable for, say, multi-unit development, that type of thing. It's not a zoning code. We've talked about this, so you're not going to be able to take this off the shelf and use it as a zoning action, but it can inform local zoning efforts, right? If you're trying to regulate and allow multi-unit in different zones, this is a great benchmark to say, hey, this is actually ensures they'll be built, right? It does not regulate all aspects of development. We can build on this over time, but it does provide housing type specific regulations. We can build on this over time with different things like public works or street standards, things like that, to provide guidance to local governments on how to regulate development. I think we've talked about this a lot. It cannot be both promising practice and kind of good enough simultaneously, right? So, it's something that's supposed to be pretty housing forward in the state. It has many fewer restrictions than a lot of different codes that I've reviewed in the state. But there can be other ways of approaching it, maybe things that are, maybe more restrictive on design standards, or maybe more restrictive on different things that are political priorities. And where are the benchmarks for that? The code can't do both of those things. And then, of course, it's not actually formatted as an adoption-ready action. It's formatted as a regulatory document, as we're directed to do. So how do we actually go to that next step of informing discrete adoption-ready actions? And that's basically the discussion that we have today. I think Kathy was speaking to this. How do we make sure that the actual provisions in this code are translated into a set of adoption-ready actions that local governments can take, and they understand, like, oh, these bonuses are intended to get at these equitable outcomes, these housing needs, these types of things, and we can take this off the shelf and use this in our local implementation efforts, right? And so how can we best support and structure that in the broader Goal 10 framework? And I know Thea and Celestine are online. They're probably going to be thinking about this a lot as they move into getting this across the finish line. But Deb, anything you wanted to add to that before we move into discussion?
No, that sounds good. I think, this discussion's a little more open-ended, just kind of exploring how you all think the model code as a whole or in parts could be sort of reformed as a off-the-shelf adoption-ready action, not for the purpose of the model code, but for purpose of adoption-ready actions. Yeah, Shannon, go ahead.
Thanks. This might actually be a better place for the tiny comments I was going to make.
Great.
I wonder about, I'm thinking about these smaller scale attached homes that are wood framed up to 3 stories and perhaps multifamily, say 6 attached units, for example. I'm also thinking about lived instances within our habitat community in which we are building these as condos anyways as part of a larger development, and we intentionally stack some units and make them ground floor so that we're incorporating some fully accessible units in the mix, and it's usually like 2 of 6, right? So much better than 10% per building, right? And I wonder, please God, the House is about to vote. I may be watching the background. We should have some improved condo defect liability reform soon in our state, please God, knocking on wood, all the things. But as condos become more feasible, maybe encouraging that kind of allowance for right ownership that's stacked through pre-approved plans, for example, just thinking of like putting all the things together. It's not a fully formed thought, but wanted to put that out there. Thanks.
No, that's awesome. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Other ideas, thoughts, questions about how provisions in the model code could become adoption-ready action? Garland.
I think, sorry, apologies for joining late this morning, but I think I came in the middle of a fire sprinkler conversation. And so I just wanted to share my perspective on fire sprinklers and then have someone respond as to how that intersects with the model code. I understand that fire sprinklers are the building code, and that this model code is more like a zoning type regulation, even though it's not a zoning code. But I think our current president has killed people by clamoring for exemptions from fire regulations and then having fires happen in his buildings, and people have died for living in non-sprinklered units. So, and especially in this era of forest fires, increasing fire severity, I think every new home should have a fire sprinkler. And I believe that through the 13R pathway, we have the ability to do so very cheaply. I would rather see every new home, including single family homes and ADUs, have a requirement for a cheap, non-alarmed fire sprinkler system. It's roughly about $5,000 a unit to install one. And I just think that we need to protect life, and we should stop trying to like trim minor costs in a way that increases danger in our homes. But in order to do so, we need to take a hard look at the fire code and look at when the fire code is requiring really expensive alarm systems or 13D systems, when 13R would do the trick and save life. And so I just want to make a plug for convening a panel to talk to the building codes decision about changing the threshold for when certain types of fire systems are required, in particular alarms, to raise that threshold higher as a compromise to also require fire sprinklers in everything, including single family homes.
Also, if I could chime in just on that. So, Garl, in the context of that conversation that you walked in, we're not talking about anything of the building code requirements that is within our control. We don't have any statutory authority on that. What we were talking about was in the context of a bonus structure where you're trying to incentivize public policy objectives for additional floors. Each of those additional floors kind of becomes less economically valuable when it requires or triggers new building code requirements. So like at 5 stories, you trigger requirements for elevator and sprinklering, right? So that can add costs. At 6, 7 stories, you move into podium construction. That becomes very expensive. Obviously, at 8 stories and above, you move into heavy timber, concrete and steel. And that's not even a consideration in this code, right? Because it doesn't really pencil in any market in the state. So the point of that was to say, hey, the higher we go in the baseline, the less valuable these bonuses become because they incur a bunch of additional costs that we don't have any control over. We don't control what the building code requires, right? So it's just a consideration as we think about how do we calibrate and structure this bonus to
Sean,
best get at the intended outcomes.
But at 5 stories, are you saying the difference is you go from 13D to 13? You go from PEX pipe fire sprinkler systems
I don't have
to hard
I don't have
steel?
the expertise to speak to that. That is
Okay.
a question for the building codes division. I was simplifying some guidance that Tony Rocco sent my way, and the basic takeaway is the higher you go, the more expensive construction gets.
Got it. Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. It's just that fire sprinklers are required when you have 3 or more units. So that's certainly not 5 stories. That's 3 units. And so I think what the threshold he's talking about is when you have to go from plastic pipe to steel pipe. But
That's fine. I'll defer to Tony on the precise requirement.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Michael.
I think there's a lot of potential for using the model codes incorporated in the ONA compliance pathways. One thing that our coalition letters have hit on again and again is the need for some specificity and like what exactly does multifamily zoning look like in these compliance pathways. And as you raised, Sean, this is an aspirational, like really good code. You can't be both promising practice and good enough. One possibility for identifying a good enough method, at least for the cities over 25,000, might be to say it needs to be at least as liberal as those medium-sized cities model code. You could say that at least such and such % of your land needs to be at least as liberal as this other thing. I think that would be a really elegant way to structure a compliance pathway for the HPS or the HAA.
Thanks, Michael. And tagging off of those model code provisions that are already existing. Helpful. Other ideas or thoughts about how the model code could be used in the adoption ready action framework?
This might be a question targeted towards some of the local planners. So like, I know some folks are working on their own structures for bonuses and incentives. And I think like, this is obviously one way of doing bonuses and incentives that get at very specific outcomes. And in thinking about like creating an adoption ready action from this, what would actually be useful, right? Like what would be the information that you would want to know? Like if you were considering either retooling your existing structure or you were going to do one de novo, what would actually be information that you would want to know to have an effective adoption ready action? I think that's a question I would like to get at.
Anyone have thoughts on that? Ariel?
Yeah, I think we're still sort of processing how this in an adoption ready action as is, or like as you've drafted it, would interact with the bonuses that we're working on proposing here in the summer. So there's still a little bit of like side by side to need to do. But don't worry, Sean, detailed comments are certainly coming your way.
If you guys are doing any feasibility studies, can you please let us know? That'd be very helpful, because I think we have refinement to go, right? And that'd be very helpful. Just that cross collaboration.
Yeah, those documents you didn't want to read from our grant because of how long they were. There's some feasibility stuff in there, but I can also flag where those are.
To be clear, I do want to read them.
Sorry, you don't have capacity. I would say it's a long document. That's all. Yeah.
I just have like 24 projects I have to.
Yeah, fair enough.
Thanks, Ariel. Other jurisdictions or those who work with jurisdictions have thoughts about how to actually make it work so people use these? More thoughts to come.
I mean, that was a concept that was brought up earlier in today's discussion, right? This idea of like that part of the refinement and calibration with local governments, right? And I think an important part of that is if we're thinking about this question of like, how do we make this useful for the Goal 10 work that you guys have to do? What would be a useful resource? How could we translate this into a useful resource for local implementation is something I'm very interested in knowing.
And I think tagging on that, I mean, we heard Kathy Wild elevate the idea of providing guidance on, which you mentioned, Sean, providing guidance to cities about different needs that are out there and how different provisions in the model code might help cities tackle those needs more efficiently. Anne.
Thank you. I was just thinking, I mean, I know this is a model code or sections of it, but if you were able to clearly identify some ARAs within it, that here's a section where, this would correlate to ARA 2B or whatever, where there's a direct cross correlation to the list, I think that would be helpful. I mean, my only fear is that we're going to implement all these things and then we will have already adopted most of the action ready things when we get to our housing production strategy, but that's a whole different issue. But I do think, because people are just going to use sections of this code, I do think if you call out, this is, this could be ARA, especially the bonus section or whatever. And I will have more detailed comments when I have time to look through it all and also look back at those the ARAs. So
great. Thanks, Anne. Good point to sort of flag where the existing ARAs that are already on the table are sort of crossing over into the model code territory. Brock.
Yeah, it's similar to Anne's comment. I think, when you're going through and you do your CHN and you realize what your most substantial needs are in terms of, proportion or difficulty of actually getting it built, being able to just like adopt a section out of this, I think should count as an ARA. I mean, we know what they're targeted towards to help see more production of, and it seems like that should be just kind of a 1-2 and you're on.
Thank you. Becky.
Just quickly, and as a follow-up to Anne and Brock on that idea of kind of there being like modules, if you will, within this that kind of respond to specific things like the affordability bonus or accessibility bonus or things like that. I think that's a like a concept that makes a lot of sense to me. I do want to flag, I think Kathy and Kate maybe can take a look at, it might be a little hard to like pull out a piece that then would make sense on its own. So anyway, I just want to flag that may or may not be a thing that this could literally do to be able to say like, oh, just adopt this section because it's like, well, what if I don't use FAR? Well, what if I use this? Well, what if my base entitlement is that? It kind of depends on the base being the same as as what's in the model codes. You'd kind of, I think, have to do the base and the bonus to be able to pull out those pieces. But I think it's a really great, it's a great goal to have, that there could be sort of elements of it, and maybe that's in guidance too,
or maybe it's just to use it as a reference, but I just wanted to flag that I think I love the idea, and I don't know how achievable it'll be. It's something we can look into more.
If I can add, the thing to know is like, so the code's written as a cohesive piece. It is also intended, the modules are supposed to be useful for different things, but they are still interrelated, right? So it's not going to be as simple as saying, you know, this one housing type, you plop it in your code as a distinct chapter and that works. It might work in some codes, but it might not in others. And I think something that we thought about a little bit is this idea of thinking about outcomes. So like a common one that I see frequently is in the middle housing model code. Design standards basically allowed cities to regulate design standards in the same way as the model code. And that was a very enticing option for a lot of cities because they didn't have to think about it. They didn't have to demonstrate anything. And so a lot of those took that language and integrated it and interspersed it in their own development code structure, but didn't, you know, wholesale take just the model code and implement it like as its own distinct chapter. Though I think a handful did, you know. I don't know why I'm losing my voice. Let me get some water.
All right, and I'm gonna give you the last comment. Sorry, Brock, and then I'm gonna move us to wrapping up. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just thinking it could be as simple as like a box that, you know, hey, this is you know, one of the ARAs, depending on, you know, how it's used or whatever, where it's not super specific, but just calling out and correlating it back to the ARAs. And it is true that it depends on where your base is, right? But you can have those caveats built into the boxes and explain whatever the tool is going to be. You know, these boxes identify, you know, these things, you know, noting some of the things that Becky just brought up. But I mean, I just think it might be helpful, especially for smaller cities, to have that correlation with some of the, because a lot of this could be used for some of the ARA compliance.
Great, thank you. Seeing some thumbs up and head nods, so good thinking, and appreciate you bringing that into the room. So I want to wrap up as we always do with thinking about just reflections on the racial equity considerations that Sean mentioned at the top, and especially the sort of addressing the historic inequities, historic and current inequities that create segregation and disparate outcomes, negative outcomes for people of different races and other protected classes. I don't know, Sean, do you have some initial thoughts? And I'll open it up to everyone to chime in. Go ahead.
Well, can I just say, I think this conversation really was framed. I think it was framed in the right way, like in the sense that we were focusing on our discussion about our entire regulatory structure for development existing in a context of you know, white supremacy and racial and economic segregation. And I think what my goal was in this conversation, I think we really did start getting at this, was thinking critically, right? We're not trying, like what we're trying to do is grapple with and understand and acknowledge that anything we produce out of this is going to exist in that legacy. And it's going to have, like, what's really going to matter are the specific, like, implicit things that the code does that facilitates outcomes. And I think we had some really great discussion on that in terms of, you know, I saw that with accessibility. I saw that with different provisions in the design standards that brought up some really good considerations. I saw that with different approaches of regulating development and design standards, including, you know, buildable form, that type of thing. And of course, I think we're seeing it too with the Goal 10 implementation framework more broadly. I think there's also some resources too that the state can do to make that connection a little bit more clear as we roll out implementation for our local government partners. And of course, ideally, make this code useful for that. So, I mean, that's my reflection on thinking about it. I don't think we got as much into the accountability. We talked a little bit about its function in the, like, its precise technical function, but we didn't focus so much on that part of the conversation. But that's okay. I think we've talked a lot about this in the context of the acceleration program too. So, you know, I think that makes sense. But that's my reflection.
Additional ideas or thoughts? Concerns? Yeah, Alan, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. I think it's I like that this portion where we tie back to the racial equity framework for decision making, because one of the things that it really provides for me is this bigger context. And I think when I think Brock brought it up and others have addressed it, this sense that if we could tie the contextualized need in a community to the adoption ready actions and then also to the model code, then we have that whole full spectrum of tying back to the racial equity framework, right? And Sean talked about the context that we exist in now, where we can't have that specific code that addresses that, those specific protected classes, but our contextualized housing need might be addressing those, might be identifying those needs. And so if there's a way to provide some guidance that ties back to how we address those, that might be one way that we look at providing that guidance to communities that might benefit from that guidance.
Thank you. So guidance on how cities could and should think about applying the model code to address their unique needs.
Yeah, relative to their contextualized needs.
Yeah. Thank you. Julia.
Yeah, I'm kind of on a similar note. First, wanted to just commend the team for all the work on this. It's definitely like a very impressive piece of work. And I was seeing reflections of some of the feedback that we had given the last time that we talked about this, especially around some of these equity topics. So appreciate kind of seeing that line carried through. And related to that, I'm kind of wondering if there's a way similar to what Anne was saying, but to maybe footnote or kind of call out specific things within the code that are in there because of equity considerations. So things like the, I know I brought up porches as like a really key culturally specific design element. I was seeing that reflected in the code, but me calling that out so that then cities can kind of intentionally carry that through into their code, even if it's not a direct copy paste. So those types of things might maybe help with some of those dot connections so folks understand it's not just arbitrarily in there. Not that I think anything in here is arbitrary, but you know what I mean? Like in terms of the equity components, it could be a little bit more explicit maybe, and that might be helpful for kind of application.
Yeah, we definitely kind of agonized over like what do specific regulations achieve and help us effectuate. And I think, yeah, maybe the next step is like once we start rolling this out for implementation, would be starting to highlight that more specifically by connecting it to the contextualized housing needs section, because like you could write an essay on like parking reform, right? You could write an essay on like specific design standards and walkability standards and that kind of thing. And I think maybe that connection to the CHN will make it a little bit more manageable, but that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that ties back to Kathy Wild's earlier comment as well, sort of flagging those issues. Brock.
Sorry, quick clarifying question, actually. So Sean, if we had like a partially vacant lot and you have a unit there, property owner's willing to sell the other part of the lot.
Yeah.
And then to get the development that they need on the vacant portion of it, right? Let's say they do like a middle housing land division and then the existing lot ends up being non-compliant with the model code that like this is within the model code. I don't know if it was in there, it might have been, but I was just thinking about it. If there's something in there that just says like previously existing structures as a result of this would be non-conforming or fine.
That's one of the 2138 refinements. The goal here will be when you have an existing house and you're adding, say maybe a cottage cluster in the backyard or a triplex, the existing home can remain non-conforming with respect to the code. And of course that concept will be integrated. We have to update the code in light of the changes that are happening with 2138. We'll have to continue updating it too as rulemaking goes on too, but that's part of the document, right? It's a live document that's going to be updated regularly. So that's definitely one of them.
Can we just wait, Sean, to
next steps?
Where you're headed next? Yep.
Yeah. So we're kind of entering that really awkward period where the biennium ends, which makes funding and contracting so difficult. But we are anticipated to continue this work into the next half of 2025. Basically, there's going to be two major deliverables that occur. There's going to be a kind of interim draft code that's developed probably around the fall. And then, of course, a final code, after that kind of public review, public comment period on the refined draft that we develop. Kind of in that interim period through summer, we'll be doing this kind of more refinement related work by getting different developers together, soliciting case examples and studies. Please send those to us too. I know there's a lot of folks with development experience or have seen development on the ground. We want to see those. We want to see your studies too, if you got them. And that will really help us with this next part of the effort. Beyond that, though, I understand that there's the other parts of the work group piece that are going on. I'll defer back to you, Deb, Thea, Celestina, if you guys want to speak to that.
Great, thank you. Thea, are you there? Folks have been juggling summertime.
I am.
Yes.
Thanks for this great conversation, folks. So yeah, we are at noon. I will just say we'll be coming back to you with sort of a load of analysis to look at on July 17th, 16th, July 16th. And we'll be getting a big packet out for you all to review a week ahead of time. So look for that in early July, and feel free to reach out if you have questions prior to that.
Great, thank you. So we'll see you all in a month, July 16th, and really appreciate the conversation and your time today. Oh, and get those written comments in, please.
Yeah, get those to us, please.
Great. Thank you all.
Bye for now. Great to see everyone. Thanks for your great work on this.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to